special going. I've enjoyed the drive down, tried to get to know some of you even this morning. I just want to mention one thing. Ron mentioned the books that are over there. I brought 3 books down. One of them is called The ISIS Crisis. So if you're hearing stuff today and saying, well, I couldn't write fast enough, you talk too fast, I brought those. They're $5 each. I brought 2 devotionals. So if you're ever saying, I need to figure out a way to get into the Word of God, I have one, 30 Days in the Land with Jesus. It's a 30-day tour of Israel, and you don't get any jet lag while you're doing it. The cost is a lot better than taking a flight yourself. And the other one's 30 Days in the Land of the Psalms. So they're 2 devotionals, and those are $10 each. But anyway, they're over on the table. Take a look at them. What I want to focus on, though, is the ISIS crisis. And right now, I say what everyone needs to know, and you would say, well, isn't what we need to know that they're gone? I mean, they're being wiped out. Even as we speak, the last pocket's being taken away. ISIS is gone. There's no problem. Mission accomplished. Well, here's the problem with that. If you follow what Americans have known about the Middle East and about Islamic fundamentalism, it usually goes something like this. Well, there was a guy named Osama bin Laden. In 2001, he blew up the World Trade Center, and then ISIS came along, and now they're gone. And we have no idea how those dots connect, what happened, what took place. And as a result, we're going to be surprised by the next event that happens, which will be just around the corner. The only question is where it will come from and what the attack will look like. So let's go into the ISIS crisis. And I want to start with just some background material. If any of you know George Santayana, he said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Americans are terrible at history and geography. We don't remember the past. We're forward-looking, and as a result, the past isn't there, which is why we keep getting into the same problems over and over again. But he wasn't the first to say it. It was King Solomon who wrote in Ecclesiastes, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. If you follow the patterns in history, you start seeing patterns repeating themselves. And usually when it looks new, it's only because we don't have a broad enough view of history to truly understand what's taken place. So in one sense, we need to start by going back to the future, stealing from a Hollywood movie of many decades ago now. But when you go back to the future, you look at America's conflict with Islam, and you realize this conflict extends all the way back to our country's founding. I'll give you samples of this at the beginning of each of the sessions, but here's one example. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams approached Tripoli's ambassador to England, Tripoli, North Africa, and they asked what right that nation had to attack American shipping in the Mediterranean Sea. The Revolutionary War had ended in 1783. Washington became president in 1789, so this is just before Washington was named president. It's right at the very beginning of our country. They went and said, what are you doing? Here's his response. The right to attack the ships was founded on the law of the prophet, and it was written in our Quran that all nations who should not have accepted their authority were sinners. And it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners. So right before Washington becomes president, the people in Tripoli are saying, hey, we have a right to take your ships. It's what the Quran told us to do. And we were struggling with Islam before the country even officially started. That conflict continued. In fact, in America's second international treaty, as we started as a country, the second treaty we made, which was signed by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in 1787, was with the ruler of Morocco. It was a treaty of peace and friendship that was to last for 50 years. Within a decade, Morocco violated it. And we began having problems in the Middle East from the very start of our country. Now, you're saying, well, how come I didn't learn that in school? They didn't teach me that in history. Well, the reality is history's selective, and they didn't select that part for us. But it's something we need to know. But that was then. We need to move to now. And the best thing I can think of is a Rubik's Cube. Why is this whole thing about ISIS so confusing? Why did it seem to come out of nowhere, create such problems, and create such havoc? Well, to solve a problem, the first thing you have to do is properly identify the root causes of the problem. If your foot hurts, it could be an ingrown toenail. It could be a broken toe. It could be gout. But it's probably not the result of food poisoning. The point being that if you have a problem with a foot, the best thing you need to do is know what's causing the problem, and misdiagnosis doesn't help solve the problem. I like Malcolm Forbes. He said it's so much easier to suggest solutions when you don't know too much about the problem. That makes our goal so much easier. Now, Peter Drucker said it this way: erroneous assumptions can be disastrous. So what have been the assumptions that have been guiding America's war on terrorism? Here's some quotes. And I found at Sun City, you got to be careful because we have Republicans and Democrats, and the one thing they agree on is how passionate they are about how much they disagree. So I have two quotes. The first from George Bush, the second from Barack Obama. So you can choose which one you like and which one you don't. But they said essentially the same thing. Here's George Bush, September 2001, right after the World Trade Center bombing. The face of terror is not the true face of Islam. That's not what Islam's all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace, they represent evil and war. Well, by the way, it's true. The vast majority of Muslims are peace-loving. If only 3%, though, are committed to terrorism, some think it's as high as 10% who would follow the strict form of Islam. But if it was just 3%, there's 160 million Muslims, or sorry, there's over 1 billion Muslims out there. You end up with somewhere between 48 and 100 million Muslims who really do believe in the cause that has been espoused by people like Osama bin Laden. Well, President Obama said it this way. He was talking about ISIS, which he called ISIL. But I like ISIS better because when you're writing a book, ISIS Crisis works better than ISIL Chrysal. But he said ISIS are not religious leaders. They're terrorists. We're not at war with Islam. We're at war with people who have perverted Islam. No religion's responsible for terrorism. People are responsible for violence and terrorism. Well, the problem with that is they're not religious leaders, except the fellow who was heading it up, al-Baghdadi, has his PhD in Islamic studies. He knows more about Islam than President Obama or any of us in this room. It wasn't just people who went out there and perverted Islam. These people would quote chapter and verse from the Quran. They would quote the different surahs. They would be able to tell why Islam commanded them to do what they're doing. Another example of it, you remember the 2016 Pulse nightclub massacre? It was an attack on a gay club by an Islamic fundamentalist. But when it happened, here was Joe Biden's quote at the time: "We're closely monitoring and fully involved in the investigation of the country's worst mass shooting. The violence is not normal, and the targeting of our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans is evil and abhorrent." But again, this is like having your toe hurt and decide that it's really appendicitis. It wasn't a gay, lesbian, bisexual attack. It wasn't an example of gun violence and why we need gun control. It was an Islamic attack. He just happened to choose that site. But that's never got mentioned in his quote, in his analysis of the problem. If you don't say the right thing about the problem, you're likely not to get the right solution. Examples. This one, priest killed in French church attack. This is back in July of 2016. He was killed in an attack by ISIS in France. A headline that most people never even noticed: ISIS has a kill list, and they named 15,000 American Christians that they wanted targeted for death, including prominent evangelical leaders. That happened that same year in August. So that leads me to 4 key facts. And this is in your notes if you want to fill in the 4 facts. Fact number 1, Islam is at the center of the problem. In 2015, the records fall behind at times, but in 2015 there were 12,000 terrorist attacks worldwide. Most were in Muslim countries. Many were carried out by Muslims against Muslims. In fact, 28,000 people were killed that year, and the most numerous victims were Muslims themselves. But none of that makes our news because we don't focus on what's happening in many parts of the world unless an American's involved or it directly impacts us. But Islam is at the center of the problem, and a lot of the violence is Muslim on Muslim. Second point under that, the Sunni-Shiite split began in the death of Muhammad. And here's where we go. In fact, this is one as a teacher. You have to start jumping around and moving your hands because your eyes will start glazing over, going in the back of your head if I don't. But you hear Sunni-Shiite go, what? Muhammad started Islam. As soon as he died, they said, who's going to replace him? And 2 groups rose up. And one said, it should be hereditary. It should be one of Muhammad's relatives who takes his place. Like a king dies, you have another king in from the family take their place. They were the Shiites. The Sunnis, this group said, no, let's follow tradition. It should be the most capable leader who was a follower of Muhammad who takes his place. The two groups split. They temporarily came back together at one point, but the split was still there and it became permanent. But the Sunni-Shiite split began after the death of Muhammad. A Sunni, by the way, comes from the word for custom or tradition, and they picked a guy named Abu Bakr. Shia means Shi'at Ali, the partisans, the party of Ali. That was the one they should follow. And that's where the name Sunni and Shia came from. Now, two maps give you an idea. Here's the map of the Middle East. Let me divide it by color. The light green is where the Sunnis are. The dark green, Iran, southern Iraq, southern Lebanon, northwestern part of Syria, and then on into Turkey a little bit, are where the predominantly Shiite groups are. And if you follow any of the problems today in the world, isn't it interesting? Well, Iran's a problem. Iran's fighting with Saudi Arabia. Those are Sunnis fighting Shiites. Southern Iraq has always tended to be a problem. Wow, you have the Sunnis and the Shiites in Iraq. Syria seems to have a problem. They have a Sunni-Shiite mix in Syria. The problems often are the Sunnis versus the Shiites. I'm still on that first point. Muslim hatred, by the way, is not just directed toward Muslims. Muslim hatred toward Jews and Christians began long before the foundation of the State of Israel or long before the Crusades. You'll often hear, well, there shouldn't have been a problem, but those Crusaders came in and they're the ones who created the problem between Muslims and Christians. Or you'll hear, if Israel hadn't started, those Jews coming into the area as invaders, there wouldn't be a problem between Jews and Muslims. Well, the problem with that is it doesn't fit with what the sayings of Muhammad and others said from the very beginning. This is from the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. The last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims will kill them, until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and that stone or tree would say, Muslim or servant of Allah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. What they're saying is, they want the end times. They want the Messiah to come, their Messiah. They want God's ending rule, but it's not going to happen until all the Jews are killed. Or another one, the Quran itself says, fight against those who believe not in Allah or the last day, nor hold that which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth. By the way, that's Islam. Even if they're people of the book. If you're a Christian, you're a person of the book. If you're a Jew, you're a person of the book. That is the original scriptures. God gave them to the Jews, they would say. The Jews didn't follow them, so God took it away, gave it to the Christians. But they didn't recognize Muhammad, so God took it from them and gave it to the Muslims. You're a person of the book, but if you haven't followed Allah, followed the Quran, they're to fight against you until they pay the jizya, that's the money paid to non-Muslims, by non-Muslims, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So until you finally recognize, yes, we're second-class citizens, they're right, they should be in charge. Their job, what they're told in the Quran, is to oppose you, to fight against you. One more verse from the Quran. Those who disbelieve from among the people of the book and among the polytheists will be in hellfire to dwell therein forever. They're the worst of creatures. So if you're a person of the book but don't believe in Islam, you're as bad as it gets. You're going to hell. And they're going to help send you there if they follow what the Quran says. One more last one. During the World War II, there was a fellow named Haj Amin al-Hussein. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem. And actually has his picture taken with Adolf Hitler. He was trying to get all the Arabs to side with Hitler against the Allied forces in North Africa. And he said, arise, O sons of Arabia, fight for your sacred rights, slaughter Jews wherever you find them. Their spilled blood pleases Allah, our history and religion. That will save our honor. So turn against the Jews, fight against these Christian invaders, the British Army and the Allied forces. That's what God wants you to do. So it's been throughout history that there have been those who said, this is what our book teaches, this is what we should follow. I don't know if you ever heard of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was a Muslim who is now an atheist. She's turned away from God completely. Written some rather incredible books. She tells her story of what it was like growing up within Islam and having to turn. But she said, Islam is being taken to its natural conclusion by Hamas, Boko Haram, and ISIS. It is what Islam teaches. They just believe it. It'd be like some people call themselves Christians, but they really don't follow what the Bible says. Well, some people call themselves Muslims, but they really don't know what the Quran says. But those who study it and say, well, that's what it says, that's what I should do, are these groups. They take it to their natural conclusion. She also said the call to violence and the justification for it are explicitly stated in the sacred texts of Islam. And you go, oh, wow, well, that's kind of problem. Fact number one was Islam really is at the center of the problem that's been around. Fact number two, the current Middle East crisis began during World War I. That's good because we could blame it on the young generation, the old generation, whatever generation you want to blame it on. And none of us alive here were in World War I, so it's their fault. But let me show you really what happened in World War I. 3 key agreements were made. If you follow the history, and by the way, if you've ever watched Lawrence of Arabia and all those groups, you get some good history. But there was a great book called A Peace to End All Peace, The Fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Rise of the Modern Middle East. If you ever like thick books that are written in a scholarly vein, it's a great book to read because this guy details everything that was done. Here's a very simple synopsis of it. 3 agreements were made. There was a promise given to the Arabs in World War I. This is where you think of Lawrence of Arabia. In fact, here's a copy of the letter that was written. I am empowered in the name of the government of Great Britain to give the following assurances and make the following reply to your letter to the Sharif of Mecca who had written. And he says, subject to the above modifications, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs within the territories and the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sharif of Mecca. In other words, he went to the Arab countries and said, if you help us fight the Turks, the Ottomans, we will give you your own country. And of course, the implication is that the Sharif of Mecca is going to be in charge. He's going to run that country. And you think, wow, that's good. Help me, and I'll give you your own country. They also made a promise to the Jews. This one you may be more familiar with, but it was also done by the British, also done during World War I. In November 1917, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So it's not that we're going to kick everybody else out, but you will have your own Jewish country. Now, they promised it in a specific area, Palestine. That was also part of the area they promised to the Sharif of Mecca. So imagine if you move into Saddlebrook and you pull up to your house, and just as you're pulling up, somebody else pulls up. And you say, well, what are you doing at my house? And they say, what are you doing at my house? And you both have a deed. It's both signed by the same guy. He sold you both the same house. But now we want you to live there. I suspect you're going to have some problems, aren't you? The British sold the same land, promised the same land to the Jews and to the Arabs, and hoped that neither side would know about it because their goal was to win the war. It gets even worse than that because there was a third agreement made. This one was between the Allies themselves, between especially the French and the British. They had a secret agreement. They called it the Sykes-Picot Agreement after the 2 representatives from those countries that made it. And it was made in 1916, before they made those other promises. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in essence, said, let's carve the Middle East up for ourselves. Now, this is a terrible note. You're never supposed to show maps with small letters, because in the back it gets hard. But let's see if I can do it. Here we are, I can do it. If you see the big letter A, and then a big letter B, and the orange and the blue. Well, in fact, A is the blue. There's an area under pure French control. If you look at this map, most of the southern eastern part of Turkey was going to be run by France. It was going to be France. And then in the area where Syria and northern Iraq are today, that's where the letter A is. They were going to set up an independent country, but the French were going to really run it behind the scenes. And then B, you see a big letter B, it's independent Arab state, but it's going to be under Britain's sphere of influence. That's southern Iraq, Jordan, and it heads over into parts of Saudi Arabia. And then there was a big orange area B. Britain was never going to give that to anybody. They wanted it. Now, why do you think Britain would want that area and the French would want the other? Oil. That's exactly right. We'll promise you whatever you want, but we're going to keep control where we think the oil is because we need that oil. We want that oil. It runs our battleships. And so the British and French carved it up They had a little orange area, a little yellow area under international control. And you say, wait a minute, I don't see that independent Arab country that was promised running itself, and I don't see an independent Jewish state. They had no plans for it. And you say, yeah, but that didn't happen, really, right? Here's what the one fellow said. Mark Sykes, of the Sykes-Picot Group, said, I should like to draw a line from the E in Akko, that's Akko today, to the last K in Kirkuk. As he's making the map up, they just had a map and a ruler. He said, let's just draw a line from here to here. That's how we'll divide it. Here's the map of the Middle East. Did you ever wonder where straight lines like this came from? They don't mark rivers, they don't mark boundaries. In fact, they cut through natural boundaries, they cut through religious groups, they cut across everything else. How did those lines come about? Let me put that other map back up. And if you can see it, what they carved on a map is what became the countries of the Middle East. There never was a country of Iran or Iraq or Syria or Jordan or Saudi Arabia as we have them today on our maps until the British came along and drew those lines. Which is why one of the British field marshals who truly understood the area said, after the war to end all war, they seem to have been pretty successful in Paris at making a peace to end peace. Because they ended up designing something that would make absolutely nobody happy. They made promises that they never intended to keep, and they divided countries in a way that would have the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shiites thrown together, vying for power. Okay, that's fact 2. Current Middle East crisis began in World War I. Fact 3, and this is one that we don't always think about, although here in Arizona we tend to do this a little more. Water is as precious as oil. And in the Middle East, it's even more precious. They got lots of oil, they don't have a lot of water. This is where Turkey comes in. Turkey, since Ataturk took over, in fact in the last 20, 30 years especially, has been putting dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers because they want to get the water so that they can have their agriculture. 22 dams, 19 hydroelectric plants have been put on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That's reduced the water flow into Syria by 40%, and it's reduced the amount of water going into Iraq by 80%. We had range wars in the past when people would cut off the flow of water for cattle. They had the giant version of a range war because they have cut off the water, and they did it at a time when they're going through a 100-year drought in the whole part of the Middle East. There's less water falling as rain, and most of that's now not even going into the countries. I'll give one example. Here's one of the dams that the Turks have built. You see this, I'll put it up here. It's going to let me do it. Yeah, there it is. There's this little ribbon of green. Right there's where they've put the dam. Just a little bit of the water has been held back. It's getting a little more defined now. That dam is starting to fill up. And the dam's filling up even more. By the way, in the lower right-hand corner, right down here, you notice the greenery? They're using the water. So Turkey is greening. It's using the water and it's helping things. However, that's the water that should have been going to Iran and Iraq and Syria. Or sorry, I said Iran. To Iraq and Syria, and it's not going there. So what's happening in those countries? A drought. And when there's drought, people can't survive on the farms. Where do they go? They pick up and they go to the cities. And suddenly you have the Sunnis and the Shiites who are living apart a bit, now crowding into the cities again, competing for resources and jobs and influence in government. And whoever's in charge is going to determine. If I'm a Sunni, I'll make sure jobs go to Sunnis. If I'm a Shiite, I make sure the jobs go to the Shiites. And it's just a recipe for internal disaster. You end up, if you're a fisherman, and your boat's beached, there's no water nearby, you've got to move. And so the Middle East has just been in turmoil because of this water shortage. So you have people even in the cities getting water wherever they can get it, polluted and all, for the essential needs of life. That's the part that also never made our news, but it's created the major difficulties. There's less water, and yet the problems grew. Muslims tend to have lots of kids. From 1980 till 2013, Syria's population grew from 9 million to 23 million. The water supply went down by 40%. The number of people went up by 150%. From 1980 to 2013, Iraq's population grew from 13.7 million to 33.4 million. And that was they had the Iran-Iraq War, when they lost so many people in the war, and yet their population just surged. The Middle East has been experiencing a prolonged drought, with the past decade being the driest in a century. And that drought still continues. This year, Israel drought broke. And Israel has desalination plants that have been getting them through. But the rest of the Middle East doesn't have those resources. They've seen a population explosion while their water supplies have dwindled, and it's created great tension. Final fact. Fact 4, the Middle East is a complex ethnic and religious tapestry. And this is where Americans tend to be at our worst. We lump everything together, we kind of simplify, and trying to simplify the Middle East is great danger. In fact, this is a problem we've had with our governments. We've made simplistic solutions. I tell people America plays checkers in the Middle East while everybody else is playing chess. We can only see one move at a time. They are looking at complex relationships, and it's why we always seem to get things wrong. How complex is the Middle East? Well, ethnically, you've got Arabs. That's what we think are all there. But you also have Jews. You have Kurds, Persians, Turks. You have the Copts, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Azeris. And that's not all the groups. That's just some of the major groups. All of these groups are in the Middle East, and yet most of them we don't know a thing about. Religiously, you have the Sunnis. They're the largest of the Muslim groups. But you have the Shiites, which are the dominant force in Iran. You have the Jews. You have the Christians, and Christians count all sects. There's a bunch of them there. You have the Druze, who are an offshoot of the Shiites. You have the Yazidis, who are an offshoot of the Shiites. You have the Baha'is. You have the Alawites. By the way, and you go, I've never even heard of them. Why are they important? The Alawites, just happens to include Bashar Assad, the ruler of Syria. The ruler of Syria is a subsect of the Shiites. He's ruling over a country that's majority Sunni. And that's one of the reasons they had such a major war in Syria for 5 years. So I keep going on. You have all these groups. Finally, the current national boundaries, those ones that the British carved out in World War I, don't correspond to these major ethnic or religious divisions. They're just straight lines in the sand. So how does it divide? Well, here's one map. These are just the different Arab dialects. You say, okay, it's in Arab. They don't all speak the same language. Of course, we have that in America, too. If you're from the South and you go to Boston or go somewhere else, they say, what? Huh? We just have simple dialects. They have far more complex dialects and ethnicities. I had a friend once tell me he could actually tell where someone lived from, even within the same area, just by the dialect and how they use certain words. My daughter and her husband went to Jordan to study Arabic. I studied it for a year and actually gave up on it for a couple of reasons, but one of which was if you don't know exactly where you're going to be serving in the Middle East, learning the Jordanian dialect may not help you in Egypt, and that doesn't help you in Syria or Bahrain or Qatar. It's just incredibly complex. That's the Arab dialects. Here's a crazy map, and you go, wait, that's too small, I don't see anything. So let me subdivide some pieces here. These are ethnic groups. Okay, you can see where so much of it's yellow. The yellow are Arab. That's what when we think of Arab, that's the area we would say Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that area, and down onto the Arabian Peninsula. Those are the Arabs. But you notice the greenery. That doesn't cover all the greenery, but the green area, those are Turkish. They're not Arabs. They're Turks. And most of what's today modern Turkey is composed of Turks, but not all of it. In fact, you notice there's an area, and I just circled that's red. That's where the Kurds are. And if you're seeing anything happening in Turkey today, in fact, Turkey's dispute with the U.S. involves the Kurds. They consider them all terrorists, the one leadership group. The greatest allies we had fighting ISIS were Kurds, and we're supporting them. Turkey now wants to go in and wipe them out. And America's faced with the problem. Turkey's part of NATO. Should we support our NATO ally, or should we support the allies who actually helped us defeat ISIS? Because the Kurds were the only major group, they're the largest group in the world that never got their own country. You hear the world, the Arabs fighting about the Palestinians and the rights of Palestinians, but nobody seems to say, what about the rights of the Kurds? They're an ethnic group, distinct language and culture, and yet their land was carved up between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And no one ever gave them their own country, nor does anybody ever really talk about it. And then the orange area, those are the Persians. That's the Iranians. And you go, wow, how come we didn't have the countries divided that way? It sure would have made the Middle East a lot easier. But the goal wasn't to make it easy. The goal was to have the Western powers control the Middle East, and that's why they drew the lines in a way that would keep these groups at rivalry. so that the outsiders could have more control. We created a mess. One last way to look at it. Here's Islam. And you think Islam's all one piece. Islam is like the Baptists. I mean, you get two Muslims, you're going to have a division, just like you do with two Baptists. But Islam's split all around. That's all I'll show you. Here's the Sunnis, the orange branch, and the Shiites are the green branch. The two main groups from Muhammad. When he died, these groups formed. But within those groups, you have subgroups. So you have the Druze. When you go to Israel, you'll see these Druze people, men with baggy pants, hanging down between their legs because they think they're going to give birth to the Messiah. They live in Israel and Syria, and they're offshoots of the Shiites. The Sunnis view them as heretics. The Alawites are over here. They're another separate group. That's the guy who's leading Syria. But it's just interesting. Iran is supporting him. Iran is Shiite. He's from a branch of Shiite. You understand now why the Syrians and the Iranians tend to have more of a alliance than you would expect. You've got to recognize it. So here's what it finally came down. If we could have divided it up, you really would end up with a Shiite state in southern Iraq and a Shiite state in Iran. You would have had a Sunni state in northern Iraq and a Sunni state for most of Syria. And then in the northern part of all those countries, there would have been a Kurdish state. And then way over on the west, you would have had an Alawite state in that dark brown. That's what you would have done if you'd have divided it by ethnic religions. We didn't do that. It's not happened. And that's why everything is such a mess. Now, here's what most people are afraid to admit, and I like who said it. It was Winston Churchill. Individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. Far from being moribund, Mohammedanism is a militant and proselytizing faith. It's already spread through Central Africa, raising fearless warriors at every step. Were it not that Christianity is sheltered in the strong arms of science, the science against which it had vainly struggled, the civilization of modern Europe might fall, as fell the civilization of ancient Rome. I think if Winston Churchill were here today, he'd revise the last sentence. Because what he was afraid of, and he thought science would protect us, Europe is going through right now. They're in the throes of having a major change. They are being Islamicized primarily through the birth rate and through the immigration that's been coming into that country. Now, you go, great, you're a real Barnabas this morning. I came here to be blessed, and you just depressed me. So this first time, let's stop with one key thing. We need to remember, God is in control. The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the people. No matter what somebody intends, whether it be a secular government or an Islamic threat, God is in control. And you need to remember that at this time. In fact, I love what Psalm 47 says. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. And Jesus himself in Matthew 24 said, there comes a time in the future when nations will rise against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. There are problems, and we're going to continue seeing them, but we've got to stop and remember it didn't take God by surprise. In fact, it's all part of his larger plan. And so we can trust that there's a God who understands and who knows where the world's going, even if we don't, and certainly not all of our leaders do. But at least with a final question here, and that is, where did ISIS come from, and how did it get so powerful? And, boy, I'd love to answer that, except I went 5 minutes over, I think, for this session, so we need to have a break. And let's take a break, and we'll come back and pick up from there, and I promise I'll talk even faster, so that we'll have the time. Had a great time, but one of the comments, especially international students say, would say, Dr. Dyer, slow down. I can't. I get excited about something, and that northeastern PA motor mouth just takes over. And if you say his accent sounds strange, it's kind of between Philadelphia and New York. That's the area I grew up, and I never lost the rapid pace talking from there. But it helps with this subject because there is a lot. If you got done with the first hour and said, I'm absolutely confused, you're miles ahead of where most of our media is. When I take people to Israel, one of my goals personally is to have them leave the trip saying, this is so complex. Because they don't get that if they watch the news. We try and summarize everything in the Middle East into 30-second sound bites, and it doesn't work. So if you don't pick up the details, that's okay. If you leave saying, there's a lot of complexity there, you have gained one of the main things I want you to know, and to realize there's a history behind these events with ISIS and others, and that's what I want you to understand. Now, well, sadly, that's the problem. Although there are some politicians, well, I got to say this the right way. There's a representative in North Carolina who's a Dallas Seminary grad in the House of Representatives, and he wrote to me when he first was elected, and he said, what should my policy be on Israel? And so I said to him, well, here's some thoughts. And it's been fun watching that he at least wanted to know the question and wanted to know things he ought to be looking for and studying. And where our politicians would be more willing to be engaged that way, I think we'd all be served better as a nation. But we're back to the ISIS crisis and what everybody needs to know. And like I did the first hour, I want to go back to the future for a second and ask you if you knew this. Islamic threats to the U.S. contributed to the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Navy, and the Marine hymn. Now, some of you may know the answer to the third part, but here's the Islamic threats in the Constitution. The palpable necessity of the power to provide and maintain a navy will be a principal source of America's security against the danger from abroad. The great emporium of its commerce, the great reservoir of its wealth, lies every moment at the mercy of events and may almost be regarded as a hostage for the rapacious demands of pirates and barbarians. Well, this is from the Federalist Papers. Sorry. The Revolutionary War ended in 1783. The Federalist Papers were written to the people of New York to urge them to adopt the Constitution. These were written, again, you can see, by James Madison in 1788. That's the year before Washington became president. And he's really saying we need to adopt this Constitution. One of the reasons we need to have a national body, not just 13 individual states, is to have a navy because of pirates and barbarians. Well, the pirates and the barbarians weren't the French, Jean Lafitte. They were the pirates and barbarians of the northern countries in Africa, the Islamic countries. Examples, in 1795, again, now this is the first years of the United States, the U.S. paid $1 million. That was 1/6 of our annual U.S. budget. Whoa, think back then. Yeah. 1/6 of our budget was paid as tribute to the Barbary states, Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco, for the release of American sailors that had been captured and held hostage. No wonder they were saying, we need a navy to take care of our shipping because we're getting decimated out there and it's costing us real dollars. The demand for still more tribute led to the establishment of the United States Department of the Navy in 1798 to prevent further attacks on American shipping. It was the Barbary pirates that forced the creation of the U.S. Navy. Islamic threats in the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. We fight our country's battles on the air and land and sea. What are the shores of Tripoli? What they're referring to is the battle, in fact it was the first Barbary War, 1805. In the first Barbary War, the Marines hoisted the American flag over the old world for the first time, and it was the Battle of Tripoli in North Africa. It was the U.S. fighting the Islamic threat. The shores of Tripoli, as I say here, refers to Tripoli and what's now Libya. Libya still gets in the news itself, doesn't it? That battle was part of the First Barbary War, and it was the first land battle fought by the United States on foreign soil following the Revolutionary War. Really was quite a dramatic battle that we went through. So Islam has been interwoven with our country and in conflict from the very beginnings of our country. Now, this book has nothing to do with Islam. But you are aware of it. The Origins of the Species by Charles Darwin. What I have it up for mainly is the drawing on the front, this evolution as he pictured it. Well, here's how I see Islam. The origin of the species. Where did ISIS come from? And it really does have a pedigree, a background. It really did evolve. But the average American doesn't have a clue how that happened. So I'm going to take you back in time to 1979. I call it a year to forget. Well, it's not completely a year to forget. My first son was born, 1979. But that wasn't the only thing that happened that year. There were a number of other things. And do you remember 3 Mile Island? That was my home state of Pennsylvania. That was 1979. You remember Khomeini? He took over in Iran in 1979. Do you remember the Iran hostage crisis? 444 days, the American diplomats were kept held as our embassy had been taken over. 1979. You probably don't remember this one. It was the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia. Thousands of individuals were killed. A group took over the mosque and called for the coming of the Mahdi, the Iranian savior, or the Islamic savior. It was really a time when the leaders of the House of Saud were on rather dangerous ground, as there was almost a revolution like in Iran in Saudi Arabia. And the other thing you may not remember, 1979 ended with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. They were there from 1979 till 1988. 1979 was an incredible year for things happening. America had gotten out of Vietnam just in the not too earlier past, and we were weak, we were isolationist a bit, and the events around the world just seemed to start spiraling out of control, both with the Soviet aggression and Islamic aggression. Price of oil went up. Remember, you had almost $1 a gallon. I remember the gasoline lines that happened then. Tremendous things that happened in that period were difficult. Well, how does that relate to ISIS? And what I want to do is connect the dots. From 1979 to ISIS, what do the dots look like? And the first dot I would put on the board would be Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. In 1979, it was the birth of twins. That is Sunni and Shiite fundamentalism. Both branches of Islam, their fundamentalism began in 1979. The Shiite branch began with Khomeini and Iran. The Sunni branch really began with the Sunni fundamentalists that were fighting in Afghanistan. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. wasn't about to send troops, get confronted there. We decided to make Afghanistan to the Soviets what Vietnam had been to us. We began supporting the guerrilla movements in Afghanistan to try and get them to just bleed the Soviets dry. The groups were called the Mujahideen. By the way, here's a group of those Mujahideen. And we called them freedom fighters. That's what our press talked about, the Afghani freedom fighters. Their technical name was Mujahideen. And if you think about that word, you notice what the middle part of that word is? It comes from the word jihad. They were individuals doing jihad against the Soviet aggressors. But we called them freedom fighters, and we started giving them support. In fact, if anybody ever see the movie Charlie Wilson's War? That's Charlie Wilson. He was a Democratic representative from Lufkin, Texas. Charlie Wilson was responsible to get the CIA to pour billions of dollars in to help fund these Afghan freedom fighters, these Mujahideen, to make this Russia's Vietnam. And it helped break up the USSR. They finished up in 1988. The Soviet Union was so weakened, and President Reagan had started Star Wars, some other things, that by 1991 the Soviet Union was collapsing and broken apart. So tremendous things are happening in Afghanistan, but it involves us supporting these Islamic fundamentalists, the Mujahideen. That's dot one. Dot two, you have another group in Afghanistan, and they're now called the Taliban. They're still around. We're still negotiating with the Taliban, trying to somehow get our U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. Well, who are the Taliban? That word means student. While these Afghan freedom fighters were fighting the Soviets, they had set up schools in Pakistan and in Afghanistan to teach these fighters who were coming in from different areas Islam and a strict interpretation of the Quran, sending them out to fight. One of those schools was started by a guy named Muhammad Omar. And you think, I don't remember Muhammad Omar. I'll show you his picture here in a minute. Muhammad Omar studied Islam, but he became also one of the fearsome fighters, one of the leaders of this Taliban, these groups of students who fought. Here's the Taliban, and there's Muhammad Omar. He lost an eye, one of his eyes in the fighting. For years, he was one of the ones we were pursuing. We think he's dead. But for years, we were trying to find him and to get him, and we never seemed to be able to catch him. But he led the Taliban. They go, so what do you mean? Well, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan. The power vacuum came. The U.S., we were supporting, we poured billions in while the Soviets were there. The Soviets leave and we leave. We have no business there, so we pull out. We left a country ruled by warlords. Muhammad Omar starts cobbling this group of warlords together, trying to establish a government, but a government based on Sharia law. He wants a strict interpretation of Sharia law. So you may remember in 2001, there was this giant statue of Buddha in Afghanistan, and it gets destroyed in 2001. The Taliban see it as an idol. It's going to be destroyed. They wipe it out. Here's where it used to be. It's no longer there. They required the women to dress head to toe in their blue burqas. Women weren't allowed to go to school. They pulled them out of school. It became a feudal society. Some people called it the land of the blue burqas. As these women took it over. These women were basically put down to chattel, and this group, the Taliban, took it over. The insurgency in Afghanistan continues. In fact, this is all the way to 2016. The orange areas are still controlled by the Taliban. In spite of us going in there, taking over that country, defeating the Taliban, we thought, they're still around. We're still negotiating. We're actually trying to figure out a way to get out of the briar patch and somehow do it without the Taliban taking that country over again. And I don't know what the solution is there yet, and I don't think our government does fully either. But the Taliban now are operating in more territory than they have since 2001. We went in to drive them out, and we didn't exactly do so well. Led to a third group. The third dot is Al-Qaeda. And you go, aha, now I'm getting somewhere. I know what that is. Well, do you know what the word Al-Qaeda means? Ready for this? It's a fancy word. Al-Qaeda means the base. And it refers to a training camp that a guy from Saudi Arabia named Saddam, I get my brain on freeze, named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden came along and started a base. He was one of those young fighters who rushed in to help in Afghanistan to drive the Soviets out. And Osama bin Laden comes along and becomes this leader. He sets up a base there. Now, here's what we need to understand. The U.S. forces helped support all that was going on in Afghanistan. We helped the Taliban get armed. They attracted people like Osama bin Laden, who became this fundamentalist follower to get rid of these foreign invaders into the land of Islam. And the Russians are driven out in late 1988. Praise God, it's good. Well, Osama bin Laden can now go back home to Saudi Arabia. And then something happened in 1990, just a little over a year later. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. You remember that? And the U.S. is going in, we're going in to stop Saddam Hussein because he invaded Kuwait, but the fear was he's not going to stop. He'll keep going. And if he went into from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia, he could have controlled at the time about 50% of the world's proven oil reserves. And the price of oil, he'd have the West and the U.S. by the throat. So the U.S. rushed forces into Saudi Arabia to try and first block him from going further and then to push him out of Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm. We saw that as something helping the Muslims, helping Saudi Arabia to stop this evil Saddam Hussein. Now put yourself in Osama bin Laden's place. What did you see? You spent several years fighting in Afghanistan because one of these Christian powers, Russia, had invaded. The West is Christian. You're either Muslim or Christian or Jewish. They're neither Jewish nor Muslim. They got to be Christian. We helped get the Christian Russians out of Afghanistan, and now, even worse, the Christian West has invaded the land of the two mosques. You have Christian forces from the West, from the United States, and they've invaded Saudi Arabia. Oh man, that got Saddam Hussein's blood boiling. We've got to do something about this. Operation Desert Shield was the first part of it. Operation Desert Storm was that second part, 1991. 1992, while we were there driving Saddam Hussein out, the very next year, we had Operation Somali Intervention. The U.S. sends forces into still another Muslim country in the Middle East. From Osama bin Laden's perspective, the Crusades are happening all over again. The Crusaders are coming back to try and take the land from the Muslims. And Saddam, I keep saying Saddam, I did my master's thesis on Babylon. I spent time in Iraq and went to Babylon twice. I was a guest of Saddam Hussein's twice. So I have Saddam Hussein on the brain sometimes. So I'll pull his name out of my memory bank for a second, put Osama bin Laden in. But Osama bin Laden is watching all of this. The U.S. forces are in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. forces are in Kuwait. The U.S. forces are now in Somalia. We're the Crusaders. We're doing what the Russians had done. And he helped drive the Russians out. It's now time for him to help drive the Americans out. If you want to remember this time, if you ever saw the movie Black Hawk Down, the Battle of Mogadishu was October of '93. And they did get the U.S. forces pulling out of Somalia. But Osama bin Laden decides we need to do more. And so he starts looking for ways to get his loyal supporters to attack and drive out these Western forces. In 1992, he has them lead an attack. They blow up a hotel. Actually, they bombed 2 hotels in Aden that year. They thought that U.S. Marines were supposed to be stationed there. It was kind of a place where they stayed on their way to Somalia. They bombed the hotels, but they didn't have good information. They didn't kill any Americans. They blew the hotels up, but the Americans weren't there. So he had bad information, but he blew the hotels up. And in our country, nobody made any association with Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, or American forces because no Americans were killed. It didn't make our news, at least on the front page. It was not a major issue. 1998, moving a little bit further ahead, Osama bin Laden tries something else. These bombings were good. He's going to do a simultaneous bombing of two U.S. embassies, one in Kenya and one in Tanzania in Africa. He gets his forces down. They blow up the embassies. 225 were killed. 12 Americans were killed. 4,000 people were wounded in those bombings. And for the first time ever, the U.S. did take notice. Our intelligence said, that was done by this guy named bin Laden. And the name was known, by the way. His father was one of the major construction firms in Saudi Arabia. So they knew bin Laden, but we didn't pay that much attention to it. In fact, our response to that was to lob some cruise missiles into this base that he had. He'd been kicked out of Saudi Arabia back to Afghanistan, and Bill Clinton lobbed some cruise missiles in and said, today we struck back. That was our response, and of course we didn't get bin Laden, we didn't get many of his fighters. All we did was further infuriated them, but really didn't respond much. Most of that, again, is in the news, and I will suspect if we had a show of hands, don't raise your hand, most of you don't even remember that. It just was a fleeting news item and crowded out by whatever else was happening. Bin Laden wasn't done yet. He keeps trying things. He sees he's getting the U.S.'s attention. He needs to do something else. And so in 2000, he came up with a great idea. We're going to fill a boat up with explosives. We're going to run it against a ship that was docking in Aden in Yemen. The ship was named the Sullivans. Unfortunately, they didn't get their perspective right. They put too many explosives on the little dinghy they were going to run up, and it sank. So they lost their chance. But they said, good idea, let's rework the plan. Same year, same plan. The U.S. brings a ship into Aden. They run the ship, they run that dinghy up with the explosives. This time they had it right, and they attacked the USS Cole. That you might remember, 17 soldiers died. Major attack on the U.S. They perfected their earlier plot. Now, why that's significant is they were trying other plots and other things were happening. There was a blind Egyptian cleric in the U.S. who tried to blow up the World Trade Center by having a truck loaded with explosives in the basement. It didn't work. People were killed, but it was a minor event. It didn't happen. But Osama bin Laden paid attention to it and said, I'll bet we could do a plan and have a better idea. All this stuff's been happening up till 2000. We still, the average American had no clue who Al-Qaeda was. And then 2001 happened. And they hijack the airplanes, and they run them into the World Trade Center and to the Pentagon, and have the one in Pennsylvania that's diverted before it can hit either the Capitol or the White House. And now suddenly, we're paying attention. We know about Osama bin Laden. We know about Al-Qaeda. But it took an attack that killed over 2,000 Americans for us to finally sit up and pay attention. But bin Laden had been working on these plans, these plots for years. This is when we stood up and said, wow, we got a problem. And most Americans think that's where Al-Qaeda came from, 2001. They don't realize it goes all the way back a decade to the U.S. invasion, that's what he'd call it, to the U.S. sending forces into Saudi Arabia to stop Saddam Hussein. But what Osama bin Laden viewed as an invasion, and he was going to do what he could to stop it, just like he did the Soviets. He just kept perfecting plans until he finally reached this one. Well, now I got to have a new dot. And the new dot is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Something happened once we stood up and paid attention and recognized who bin Laden was and what was happening. The U.S. put the might of the U.S. Army against Osama bin Laden. We asked the Taliban to give him up. They refused. We invaded Afghanistan. Our goal was to get bin Laden. Now, what happens? October 2001, U.S. forces invade Afghanistan to drive the Taliban from power and to capture Osama bin Laden. December, next 2 months later, bin Laden escapes from Tora Bora, this rugged mountain area. I love this area, by the way, where you're at. You get a perspective on what Tora Bora is like. Just picture what you have around here, only on steroids, and you've got Afghanistan. He escapes from Tora Bora. He goes into hiding in Pakistan. He's there for years, but Al-Qaeda is faced with a choice. They've had one central leader, Osama bin Laden. Well, he can't do very much. If he sends out a broadcast, he sends out a tape, it's immediately looked at, analyzed to try and figure out where he is so that we could attack him and kill him. So he goes into hiding, and from that point on, Al-Qaeda's leadership is in this hiding. So to survive, they developed a franchise model. I love to think of it as Al-Qaeda took a page from McDonald's. But what they did was said, look, we can't be everywhere at once. We can't have the same kind of control. So what we'll do is divide this. Bin Laden and then his second in command, al-Zawahiri, were in control. We'll send out messages, but Iraq, your leadership will run your area as you see fit. And Syria, your leadership will run your area as you see fit. And they would set up these franchise groups, all loyal to bin Laden or al-Zawahiri, but all kind of doing their own thing so that the U.S. couldn't be able to pinpoint the leadership and find them. And so they start that franchise model. While bin Laden's in hiding, the guy who comes as his main spokesman is Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was a medical doctor in Egypt. He has none of the charisma of bin Laden. After bin Laden was killed, you notice you didn't hear a lot about Al-Qaeda. They kind of disappeared from view. This guy just didn't have the charisma. They're still around. In fact, they could potentially be growing again, but not from this guy. He just didn't have the charisma to keep them going. In fact, the most dangerous new event is that he seems to have been replaced as the head of Al-Qaeda by Hamza bin Laden. That's Osama bin Laden's son. He took over. We are now offering a $1 million reward for him. He's got the charisma of his dad. He's got the hatred of the U.S. because we got rid of his dad. And he is now back in apparent control of Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda is still around, but they went into this franchise mode. And some of the franchises did okay, some didn't. You'll hear the one in the Philippines. You'll hear the one in some of them in Africa. The one that became the stellar pupil of them all was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And here's the guy who's in charge. By the way, if you want to name your dog or cat something, Abu Musab al-Zakari would be a great name for the animal. Except it needs to be a pit bull if it's a dog, because this guy was as brutal as a pit bull. He's resurrects Al-Qaeda in Iraq, brings it along. Remember, the U.S. had a push. We had really tried to get rid of Al-Qaeda. We had almost succeeded. And then Obama came in and he withdrew that U.S. push that we had. And right when it looked like Al-Qaeda was about gone, we took the pressure off. Right about that time, this guy took over from the fellow we had killed. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi did a couple things. He decided Al-Qaeda wasn't doing enough. Al-Qaeda had been attacking the West. He says, we need to be attacking the West, but we also need to be attacking the disbelieving Muslims, meaning Shiites. Well, he's in Iraq. It's Shiite and Sunni. So he starts attacking Westerners and Shiites. He also decided we need to do this in a little more dramatic fashion. And so he began beheading individuals and recording it. In fact, some of the Westerners that were there, some of the first Westerners who were beheaded, were personally beheaded by Zarqawi. And photographed, including a reporter. He did get attention and media attention from that. Now, he was killed in 2006. The U.S. troop surge was just there, but right after he was killed, we stopped, and it leads to the next thing. My final dot is ISIS, or you'll hear it called ISIL, or you'll hear it in Arabic areas called Daesh. It's all the same group. But it really was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq is what it started out to be. Zarqawi was killed, but another guy comes along, and his name is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I like that. He's Abu Bakr, the guy from Baghdad. He's got his PhD in Islamic studies. He is a recognized expert in Islam. But he also becomes this pretty potent warrior, and he resurrects Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then he makes an announcement. He took over Al-Qaeda in 2010. And U.S. troops finally pulled out of Iraq in 2011, so he has a free hand. So he begins growing the troops. Right about that same time, lest you think this is getting too easy, the Arab Spring happens. Remember the Arab Spring when all these dictators began being overthrown, and the U.S. supported the overthrow of the leader of Egypt, and it looked like the leader of Syria was going to be gone. Well, within that growing Arab Spring was a growing Arab Spring of Islamic fundamentalists. And this guy takes advantage of it for the Sunnis and says, follow me, this is the time that Muhammad and Islam talked about. We are now going to drive the West out. We're going to set up the caliphate. It's time for the end times, and I'm going to lead it here. So suddenly, it seemed out of the blue, you have the Arab Spring created in Syria, and you have this hostile takeover happening. Al-Baghdadi has Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There's an Al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Baghdadi announces a hostile takeover, using business terms. He said, by the way, I'm now over Al-Qaeda in Syria. Zarqawi, the head of Al-Qaeda, wrote a letter and said, no, you're not. I refuse to give permission. To which Al-Baghdadi says, no problem. I'm now creating the Islamic Caliphate, the ISIS group that we know. He just turns his back on Al-Qaeda and says, this is the new group, we're the caliphate, we're setting up the kingdom. And he does. He takes this hostile takeover of the al-Nusra front in Syria, and suddenly Syria and Iraq have this group that seems to be coming out of nowhere. Now, ISIS tried some new things. They captured Mosul, and that's when they really took the world's attention. Just a few thousand troops defeated 20-some thousand Iraqi troops that basically threw their weapons down and ran. ISIS now had control of these incredible weapons made in America and heavy machinery, and they set up a government. They were taxing people. They were taking the oil. They were pumping it. They were making billions of dollars a year to fund their enterprise. Now, they had money, and the other thing they did was a little different than Al-Qaeda. They had social media expertise. So they began doing things like this. They would film beheadings and have spectacular events and put them out on social media. They would film the beheadings of Christians, of Westerners, of Shiites. They would do crucifixions. They would look for new and creative ways to kill their enemies and film it and put it out there to tell people it's time for a Sunni power. The time for the kingdom is here. Follow us. In fact, the major differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS are these. Al-Qaeda, well, they had a different strategy. Al-Qaeda wanted to defeat the West before setting up the caliphate. ISIS says, no, we'll defeat the West after we set up the caliphate. Let's get the land, let's set up the kingdom, and then God will lead us, Allah will lead us to defeat the West afterward. But the goal is to get the kingdom set up first, the caliphate. They had different tactics. Al-Qaeda primarily was guerrilla warfare. We're going to do these bombings and attacks. ISIS said, we're going to build a conventional army. And we're going to take over territory and hold that territory. And they had different targets. Al-Qaeda was primarily against the West. And the attacks were against the West. ISIS said, okay, we're going to attack the West, but we'll also attack the Shiites and Christians and Druze and Kurds and Yazidis. They're all unbelievers. We'll go after them all. And they did. They were just absolutely brutal in the areas they took over. One other difference between them, different media approach. Al-Qaeda was using audio-visual messages. So you'd see a tape of bin Laden with a sheet behind him giving command to his forces to attack. But they didn't want you to know where he was, and they would only come out every 6 months or a year. ISIS would set up social media blitzes. They put out a slick magazine that they would put out. They would put out they knew how to use social media. It was a totally different generation. The old generation was Al-Qaeda. This is the new and cool generation reaching the new group of Muslims. They also had different funding sources. Al-Qaeda had been supported by donors, primarily, people who believed in them, who were wealthy, who were just funneling money quietly to them. But ISIS was selling oil. By the way, they were running that oil across the border into Turkey, which was turning a blind eye. And as Turkey was selling things, and actually they got into a problem because one of the Turkish military leaders actually they filmed a group of Turkish trucks taking supplies and ammunition across the border into Syria for ISIS. And the guy who did that ended up in prison. So Turkey, our ally, was funding it for their interest, ISIS, because ISIS was attacking the Kurds, who the Turkish leadership doesn't like. It is very complex. But they had oil sales. They seized assets. They raided banks, took out the gold. They taxed the people that were under their control, just like a regular government would. They suddenly had far more wealth than Al-Qaeda ever did, which is why they were able to just promote that program of oppression so much. In fact, here's ISIS's goals. This is their magazine, Tabiq. One should remember that enslaving the families of the kuffar, the infidels, and taking their women as concubines is a firmly established aspect of Sharia, that is Islamic religious law. Our goal is to kill the people and take those wives and force them to have babies that'll become ours, that'll make our army grow. And they said, and that's what Islam teaches. That's what we should be doing. So what were their goals? Well, one of them wrote, well, we fear not, this is from their magazine as well, we fear not the swarms of planes, nor ballistic missiles, nor drones, nor satellites, nor battleships, nor weapons of mass destruction. How could we fear them while Allah the Exalted has said, if Allah should aid you, no one can overcome you? You wonder what some of them are saying right now. Because the last tiny sliver of land that they control is now being taken away. In a matter of days, it likely will be gone. But does that mean the ISIS is over? Well, here's how they're responding. If you can kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, I love that, but if you can kill an American, but especially those crummy French, or an Australian, or a Canadian, or any other disbeliever from the disbelievers waging war, including the citizens of the countries that entered into a coalition against the Islamic State, kill the disbeliever, whether he's a civilian or military, for they have the same ruling. That is, the official rule from the Islamic leadership is, any Westerner you can get a hold of, kill him. And so they're looking for lone wolf attacks anywhere in the West. That's what they would try to have. By the way, there were probably 30,000 or more ISIS volunteers who left the fighting in Syria and Iraq, who are not accounted for. Some slipped back into Europe, some slipped back into other countries, but they don't know where they are. But they're probably as loyal still to the goals of ISIS as they were. And this is the command for them from the Islam. So unless they turn against Islam, the Islam they were taught is any chance you get, look for a way to kill someone. You're helping Allah by doing that. You think about some of the things they've done apart from the battle in Syria. The UK said a Russian plane may have been downed by an explosive device. It was in the southern part of Egypt, and an ISIS sympathizer managed to slip explosives on it back in 2015. That plane went down. Let me just take you on a tour. Breaking news, ISIS behind attacks in Paris. Those filthy French. 100 dead, hostages taken, emergency declared. That was November of 2015. Special report, female shooter posted statement of support for ISIS, December 15. That was in San Bernardino, California. Whether 14 killed, I think 20-some wounded in that attack. Again into 2016, it was a January, Istanbul blast, 10 killed, 15 injured at the bombing near the Blue Mosque, which is why, if you've ever been to Istanbul, you've been by the Blue Mosque. I knew exactly where those people were standing when they were blown up. It goes a little bit further, March of 2016. ISIS in the Brussels airport. 35 were killed, 300 were wounded in one of these attacks. Again, into June of 2016, it's interesting, Turkey started feeling the effects. They turned against ISIS because ISIS turned against them. Terror in Turkey, there were 2 explosions. 44 people were killed in the Istanbul airport in that attack. New York Times report, 84 died in a French seaside as a truck driver ran a mile-long rampage, just started running over people. It was July of 2016. You could keep going and on and on and on. And in fact, even just the attack this last week in Netherlands is very likely a terrorist attack sponsored by someone supporting ISIS. It keeps going, but you got to stop and say one thing. God is in control. And I got to keep reminding you of that. In fact, I go to the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk has a complaint against God in chapter 1. He looks at his own country and says, Lord, this place is just terrible. How can you let evil run amok like it is? How can you let these people go without punishing them? You tolerate evil in our country. And God gives him a response. He says, good answer for you, Habakkuk. I'm raising up a nation to bring about judgment. I'm going to raise up some group. They're going to cause the judgment. And he talks about how evil they are, how unstoppable they are. It was the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, Lord, I got a problem with that. How can you use people that are even more wicked than us? If the Babylonians are going to destroy us, you ought to destroy them. Well, if you look around the world today, you can look at times and go, man, why are things happening the way they are in our country? And then you look at some of these other things and say, well, wait a minute, they're even worse than we are. Lord, how can you allow things like that to happen? How can you work these things out? And God's response to Habakkuk is interesting. He says, I'll take care of them at the proper time. In the meantime, just trust me. And I think what we need to remember is at times we get frustrated looking at our country and seeing things that just don't seem right. And then we look at what's happening in other places like at ISIS and what they've done in the Middle East, and we get even more frustrated. And we need to stop and just remember something. God is in charge, and he says that at the right time, justice will happen. God will make sure that those who do right will be rewarded. God will make sure that those who do evil will receive judgment. But his timing isn't our timing, and we get so confused as a result. We just need to at times stop and just say, okay, Lord, I've got to let that in your hands. But I've got to end this session by asking you one quick question. Can anything be more dangerous or deadly than ISIS? You know, they have been the epitome. They're on their last legs, it looks like now. But could there be anything out there that's even worse than ISIS? And the answer, I think, is yes. But since it's now time for a break, we've got to come back after the break to find out what that answer is. So stay tuned and come on back. Okay. And hopefully that sound, there it is. All right. Session 3. What did everybody need to know about ISIS and Back to the Future? We've got to start there again. Did you know that America's early conflict with Islam influenced our national anthem? This is one, it took a little bit of study for this, but it was interesting. 9 years before he penned the Star-Spangled Banner, Francis Scott Key penned another poem. And he used the same musical tune to accompany it. And the poem was on America's victory over the Barbary pirates. Now here's the third stanza of the poem. You'll understand why this would not have made a good national anthem. But I've got to, let's see if I can play it here, just so you can hear the music. Let's see if it, right? Restless, each toil they endured, till their foes fled dismayed from the war's desolation. And pale beamed the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation, where each radiant star gleamed a meteor of war. and the turbaned heads bowed to its terrible glare. Now, mixed with the olive, the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brows of the brave. Now, that's one you can take a knee on. But you did notice it. He used the same tune. He used some of the same phrases. Star-spangled flag, the glare, the shall wave of the brave. He wasn't one to waste a good phrase, and he reused them again. But the original one dealt with the crescent. That is the flag that the Islamic people had, and the turbaned heads bowed. Here's the war that he was talking about as we fought those the Barbary War. So even our national anthem got some of its phraseology and tunes from the conflict that was going on with Islam. There was a friend of ours who said, but that was then, but this is now. So is Islam, or is ISIS especially still a threat? And when somebody came up between the break and said, the news flash just came, ISIS's last pocket just fell. So while we're having this conference, ISIS is officially over as a state. Does that mean that we have no more things to worry about from ISIS? Well, is it still a threat? Here's some explanation. David Friedman wrote, the Middle East is in the biggest mess it's been in modern times. Fascists, jihadists, haters of Christianity, and declared enemies of the West represent all sides of the current conflict. If you catch what he's saying, it's not that there's just one side that's a problem. It's no matter which side you pick, you're going to find people representing hatred of what we stand for, opposition to us. Donald Trump said he wanted to cut off the head of ISIS, and part of doing that was putting a temporary ban on Muslims entering the U.S., and it was a tremendous uproar. We're still fighting that struggle. Is it a problem with Islam? Is it just a problem with what was happening in Iraq and Syria? Breaking news sources, U.S. preparing to withdraw significant numbers of troops from Syria as Trump claims victory over ISIS. He said, we're winning, and while it's virtually over, let's just bring our forces out. Now, I understand why he's saying that, but what that doesn't fully comprehend is even though ISIS as a national entity fell, there were still upwards of 30,000 ISIS fighters that have now blended into the countryside. In fact, ISIS could reclaim territory in months without military pressure, warns Pentagon in a draft report. That was dated January 31st of this year. They warned that without continued U.S. pressure there, they could regain all the territory they lost in 6 to 12 months. Because the Syrian army and the Iraqi army do not have the strength to conquer them, and because of the Sunni Shiite problem. Syria is supported by, it's an Alawite government, that's on the Shiite side. The government of Iraq is dominated by the Shiites, and the government supporting them is Iran, which is Shiite. The Sunnis in all those countries, which are the majority, are feeling oppressed. And without someone to hold them down, it could turn into that religious conflict very quickly. From Syria, ISIS slips into Iraq to fight another day. We just defeated them in Syria, but indeed, thousands of those fighters already had gone back into northern Iraq trying to reset up the cells that they launched from before. So are they still a threat? Yeah, they are. That's just the reality of it. It's like, if you ever play whack-a-mole, took our kids to Chuck E. Cheese and they had the whack-a-mole, and you'd whack-a-mole down one place and it would pop up somewhere else. Well, ISIS, Al-Qaeda are like whack-a-mole. And you get rid of them in one area, but if you're not careful, they're going to show up somewhere else. But then, if you watch television and they're selling you something, right in the middle of it, they say, but wait, there's more. If you order within the next X minutes, you'll get. So, wait, there's more. What could be worse than ISIS? As bad as ISIS has been, and we're glad to see that caliphate disappear. Is there something that's even worse than ISIS? And I think there is, and in this session, I actually want to take a slight detour and talk about what's even worse than ISIS and what's on the horizon. And then we're going to come back on the final session after lunch and actually focus on what can we do about Islamic fundamentalism, ISIS in general. But what's worse than ISIS? General Joseph Dunford, the Senate confirmation hearing in July 2015, so it's been a couple years now, but he was right on target. He said, my assessment is that Russia poses the greatest threat to our national security. And if you look at their behavior, it's nothing short of alarming. Now, this has nothing to do about Russia influencing the elections. That's just a minor sidelight. He's saying, if you look at what's happening in the rest of the world, the greatest threat to America and to American policy is Russia. Second, by the way, would be China. But he saw Russia being even more of a threat. So what's happening is in relation to the Middle East. Reports of Russian military buildup in Syria fueled concern. Well, a Russian submarine with 20 ICBMs and 200 nuclear warheads went to Syria. Russians shipping tanks into Syria, first clear sign of offensive weapons. NATO was worried about Russia's alleged military buildup in Syria. They should have been. Syria was ready to fall. Assad was on his final legs with the forces that the U.S. had helped to bring about his fall. Russia comes in, props up Assad. He's going to stay in control of Syria. In spite of using chemical weapons, in spite of crossing the red lines we had placed down, he's going to still be there. He's going to win, and it's because of Russia and Russia alone made the difference. Russia now has a permanent military base in Syria because they paid the price to keep him in power. They're going to collect the benefits from that. Russia's dominating in Syria, certainly. Let me go somewhere else. Here's Russia and Syria. Putin defies the West with strikes on Syrian weapons. Putin angers the U.S. with airstrikes on Syria rebels. Putin was the one making the attacks. In fact, this is the way Putin handles rebels. We're trying to make sure we don't kill innocent civilians. Putin's groups, both Syrian army with his support and even Russian fighters, would drop massive barrel bombs, massive ordnance on a hospital. They would kill some of the rebels, and they would kill all the doctors and nurses and any other patients that happened to be there. But that's what it took to stop the rebels, and Russia was paying that price. They were willing to do what it took to keep Assad in power, and as a result, Assad's going to stay in power, and Russia is one who helped accomplish it, and Assad owes a big debt to Russia, and Russia will claim that debt. Moving on to another area, Russia, not just with Syria, Iran. Russia and Iran signed military cooperation agreement. Russia and Iran just got closer. Iran and Russia discuss increasing military ties. Iran blasts the U.S. for violation of nuclear deal. If you've seen Putin and the leader of Iran lately, they seem to be meeting every couple months. In fact, here's the picture, Rouhani and Putin together. Russia has made major inroads into Iran. As the U.S. has tried to put more pressure on Iran, Russia's been doing everything they can to violate our attempts to put sanctions on. Russia was even taking Iranian oil, taking it to Russia, processing it, and then selling it as Russian oil to get around the sanctions. Russia is selling military hardware and other hardware to the Iranians. Russia's supplying what Iran needs that we're not letting other nations supply. And Putin's doing it. There's a growing alliance between Russia and Iran, CNN reported. Just keep following it. You're seeing Russia, one of the greatest, as the U.S. began threatening, if you don't stop with the nuclear program or you go on, we will consider attacking. And we've made blunt of threats. The response of Russia was to sell the S-300 missile system to Iran, which they put around the nuclear facilities in other areas, saying, in effect, you try and attack us, we'll do everything we can to shoot down your aircraft. For the first time since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Iranians allowed the Russians to use Iran's bases for some of their bombers, for their attacks on Iraq. Their growing economic and military cooperation between Russia and Iran is astounding. And you go, okay, so I see Russia, I see Iran, I see Syria. Is that the concerns you have for the Middle East today? Well, there's one more. It happens to be Russia and Turkey. A gas deal benefits Russia and Turkey. From Turkey-Russian partnership, high stakes, high risk reward. Turkey's foreign minister pays official visit to Russia. Is it possible Turkey's going to form an alliance with Russia? What you see more and more often is Erdogan, the president who really fancies himself as the next Pasha, the next major religious leader of Turkey, meeting with the head of Russia, Putin. They went together. Now, that their alliance was almost derailed at the very beginning of the Syrian war. Turkey was opposed to Syria. Russia was supporting Syria. Russia had its planes, and if you remember, there was one Russian plane that strayed over into Turkey. Turkey shot it down. Russia responded very, very negatively to the point where they threatened Turkey. Turkey backed down. Turkey and Russia became friends. Turkey, who was saying that the head of Syria has to go, Assad cannot stay, is now saying, well, he's probably going to stay, it's not a problem. And they're building cooperation with Russia. Turkey had a coup. Real debate's still out, I think, on whether it was a failed coup or a pseudo coup. It was a coup that it seemed like it would have been relatively easy to get rid of Erdogan. The plane that was tracking him could have shot down his helicopter. It didn't. Erdogan gained popularity, and in the process, that 2016 coup, he basically wiped out all opposition to him. Any opposition newspapers, the reporters were jailed. Opposition candidates were gotten rid of. He gained popularity, and he used it to make his party the dominant party in Turkey. And so, what do they say? Well, Erdogan canceled 50,000 passports. I love that one. Oh, it won't let me go back. Let me see if it will. Let me go back to this one. No, you're going to have to read it faster when it comes up. Next one comes up after that, the coup. There. U.S. Commander Campbell, the man behind the coup. Turkey blamed the U.S. for the coup attempt in Turkey. It was us that was trying to get rid of Erdogan, he says. We denied it, doesn't matter. Erdogan is refocusing toward Russia, Iran, and Syria, and it's a major loss for Washington, the major news media are saying. Erdogan right now, he wants to buy the F-35 jets, our stealth fighters, but he wants to buy the Russian S-400 anti-missile defense system. And it puts the U.S. in a problem because if he has it and Russia has access to the data, they could soon learn the characteristics of the F-35, which is our primary offensive weapon. So are we going to sell this system, the F-35, to a nation that's in NATO that we promised it to, or are we going to hold it back because he's buying something from Russia? And Erdogan isn't backing down. I have a feeling, and I'm hoping, that we won't sell the jet. Could fracture that coalition, but frankly, right now, Erdogan is more in the orbit of Iran and Russia than he is in NATO. So you have Russia and Iran, and you have Russia and Turkey growing in friendship, and Iran and Turkey growing in friendship. And you think, boy, if there was an unholy trinity that I wouldn't want to have together in the Middle East, they're the ones. And each of them has ambitions. Turkey wants to reconstitute the Ottoman Empire. Iran wants to reconstitute the old Persian Empire. Russia wants to dominate the Middle East and get the freshwater access for its troops and control the oil that will influence the West. Each has its own reasons for wanting to be in the Middle East, but each is using the other in an alliance to get to the Middle East. So you end up with Turkey and Russia and the Iranians, and you say, man, that is a power alliance that is a frightening alliance, and it should certainly scare the United States on a political perspective. This year, at Sochi, Russia, all three met, and they were there to decide on the future of Syria from their perspective. And it includes the U.S. leaving the area. It includes them carving up the area in a way that will fit their plans. Now, Iran is perhaps the most vocal on what their plans are. Here's Khamenei said, the usurping regime that now rules Palestine, read Israel is what he's talking about, now has no rights. It's a fictitious regime built and propped up by the oppressing powers. That's us. We're the oppressing powers. The Zionists think that they control Palestine and it's theirs forever. No, that is not so. Firstly, Israel will not see the next 25 years. So he's put a limit. As the religious leader speaking for God, he said, you won't see Israel in existence within 25 years. Secondly, until then, struggling, heroic, and jihadi morale will leave no moments of serenity for Zionists. We will help support everybody who can attack Israel. But know this, Israel won't be there within 25 years. How serious are they about it? Let me show you just a very brief movie that was put out by Iran. You'll see these soldiers all buckling up, and you'll notice all different emblems, different styles of guns. It's all different Arab armies. from Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah. This video was produced in Iran. An army's getting ready for war. And you get an idea, I wonder where they're heading to. If that doesn't look familiar, that was the Dome of the Rock. You think it's over, but one more shot here. The army's on its move. And there's where they want to go. So what's the goal of the Iranians? From the time of Khomeini till today, it's to take over the city of Jerusalem, to wipe out the nation of Israel, to take over that area. 3 nations are together. We certainly know what the goal of one is. And I think we can find what the goal of the other is by turning not to current events, but to the Bible. I want you to turn to Ezekiel 38 and 39 if you have your Bibles. You may have been saying, I came to the thought we were going to be studying the Bible. He has not done a whole lot with the Bible. Well, here we go. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is a passage written right as Israel had fallen to the Babylonians. Ezekiel's in Babylonian captivity. He begins writing about a time when God's going to bring Israel back. And he starts describing something that from the day he wrote it till today has never happened. It's just never taken place. He says, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm against you, O God, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and will turn you around, put hooks into your jaw, and bring you out, and with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, you're fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. And then he names some other people. I got to stop, though. You start reading this, you go, oh man, I knew there was a reason I never liked to read the book of Ezekiel. I mean, Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, what in the world is this guy talking about? So it sounds bizarre, but Ezekiel's mentioning real people and real places. In fact, he's writing about a man. He names him Gog. And so the question is, who is this Gog he's talking about? Well, in Ezekiel's day, in fact, just 75 years before Ezekiel wrote this, there was a guy named Gog or Gyges or Gugu. He's translated his name a couple different ways. But he was an actual guy. He lived in Lydia. That's western Turkey. He killed the king. He wasn't the king. He took the throne by killing the legitimate leader. And to legitimize taking over the throne, he married the guy's wife. So not exactly a nice guy. He was willing to do whatever he wanted. But he was the king of Lydia, and he ruled from 680 to 644 BC. He seized this kingdom illegally. He expanded it militarily. He just kept growing it by conquering people around him. He was so significant that in his day, you go, well, I never heard of him. But in his day, people who lived hundreds of years later talked about him. You've heard of Herodotus. Herodotus tells the story about this guy and how he took over. It was that well known. Plato actually talks about him in his accounts. So 200 years after this guy lived, there are major philosophers and historians writing about this guy and what he had done. He's so important that in history they found this clay tablet, and it was from Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. And it described the reception of an embassy from Gyges. His name was Gugu. Gugu, sounds like a baby name, kind of cute. But Gog, this Gyges, he was the king of Lydia around 665. He is a significant player in history. Nations know him and fear him. He died about 70 years, plus or minus, before Ezekiel recorded these chapters. And you say, so what about that? He's a guy, he's dead, so why would Ezekiel describe him? Could you imagine today if somebody stood up and said, there's going to be a leader come along, I'll tell you what he's like, Hitler. Hitler's been gone a little over 75 years, and yet you mentioned his name, and immediately a character forms, doesn't it? The brutality, the ambitious plans, the way he could plunge the world into war. our mentioning of Hitler today in connection with someone, and by the way, that's still being done, isn't it? What was the most recent one they compared Trump to Hitler? They're trying to draw a comparison through the name. That's what Ezekiel does. He says there's a leader coming. By the way, you want to know what he's like? Just remember Gyges, remember Gog. And that's what he does. He's basically saying this guy who's coming is going to share all the characteristics of this world leader of recent past who was just horrible. Hitler died 70 years ago, and again, imagine someone talking about the rise of another Hitler. Well, that's what Ezekiel does. He says, there's a guy coming, and he tells us where he's from. He says he's from the land of Gog, or Gog from the land of Magog. Well, most of us don't have maps with Magog on it, but they were places that were known. He could have pulled out a map in his day, and here's the map. You see where the Black Sea is, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf. We're in the Middle East. He starts talking about this place. He says, Gog's from the land of Magog. That was the area north of the Black Sea. This leader who's coming was from the area north of the Black Sea. And he says he also was prince of Meshech and Tubal. Well, Meshech was in the area just to the east of it, the area just north of the Black Sea, between the Black and Caspian Seas. And then he mentions Tubal, same general area in that Caucasus region between the Black and Caspian Seas. But he goes on, he says he's going to have some allies with him. In fact, he says in verse 5, Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with their shields and helmets. Also Gomer with all of its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all of its troops. Many nations with you. This guy's coming, he says, but he's not just coming alone, the guy from the far north. He has some allies. The first is Persia. Persia is today where Iran's located. He mentions Cush. Cush was the country in his day that was south of Egypt. That's the Sudan region today. Put was the country that was west of Egypt. Today it's where Libya is. But he says these people are coming, and then he mentions a couple others. He said also Gomer and all its troops. Gomer was also in that Caucasus region between the Black and Caspian Seas. And he mentions Togarmah or Beth Togarmah. Beth means house, the house of Togarmah. Togarmah was the area we would say today is Asia Minor. It's modern-day Turkey. A king from the far north is coming on the scene. He has an impressive array of allies, and he says they're going to come to attack. In fact, he says, get ready, be prepared. You and all the hordes gathered about you, take command of them. After many days you'll be called to arms. In future years you'll invade a land that's recovered from war, whose people were scattered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been long desolate. They've been brought from the many nations, and now they all live in safety. You and all your troops of many nations with you will go up advancing like a storm. You'll be like a cloud covering the land. He said, Ezekiel says there's going to be a battle. And it's against a group of people that were in captivity. They're back from captivity. They're living in the land of Israel, and they seem to be relatively safe. These nations, as armies, are going to come and attack the nation Israel. From the day Ezekiel wrote that till today, that's never happened. In fact, from the day Ezekiel wrote it till just the last year or two, the idea of having some of those individuals as allies being led by a group from the far north seemed absolutely absurd. It doesn't seem so absurd now. In fact, it seems very likely. You're looking, okay, who would be the dominant power in all of those that would get them all together for an attack? Russia certainly seems to have that. Russia plays chess. The U.S. and the Middle East has played checkers. And Russia has always been thinking multiple moves ahead in their plans. So Ezekiel comes along and says, I'll tell you who's going to be involved in the attack. I'll tell you what's going to happen, where they're coming from, and I'll tell you why they're coming. They're going to come down here to try and take this land that seems secure. Why would Russia want to do that? Well, he doesn't tell us here. Possible reasons. Russia wants to build the alliance with these countries. Russia wants to dominate the oil industry, which is its major bread and butter. Russia is watching the natural gas lines that Israel's now planning to build to supply natural gas to Europe, which will be competing with Russian natural gas. There are all sorts of reasons. Russia would like to take over the U.S. influence in this region. Russia will use Turkey and Iran to accomplish its purposes. For all those reasons together, this just says there's going to be an attack, and it's coming against Israel. Now, God says, but let me tell you what's going to happen when this attack takes place. God's going to stop it. And now he's going to tell us how it's going to, sorry, as I bump down here, I bend into the pipe, I'll keep my head up. How is God going to take care of this? Well, I'll pull my Bible, that'll make it easier. He says, beginning in verse 10, this is what the sovereign Lord will do. On that day, I'll come with, thoughts will come into your mind, and you'll devise an evil scheme. You'll say, I invade the land of unwalled villages. I'll attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls, without gates and bars. I'll plunder, loot, turn my hand against all the resettled peoples, and they're all rich and living in the center of the land. And then he goes on and starts describing it. I'm going to drop down for just a second for the sake of time. He says, verse 12, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Are you not the one I spoke of long ago, and my servants the prophets, and about this? In that day when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be roused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare at that time there will be a great earthquake. How's this group going to get stopped? Well, it's not going to be the Israeli Defense Force. And it's not going to be the U.S. alliance with Israel that we've touted. God says when this group starts invading, it looks like nothing's going to stop them. And suddenly there's going to be an earthquake. Israel sits on a major earthquake zone. In fact, here's the whole Middle East. There is an African plate moving one direction, the Arabian plate moving the other, and there's a rift that runs from Turkey down through the Jordan Valley of Israel and down into Africa. About every 700 years, there is a major earthquake within Israel. They're actually overdue for a major earthquake in Israel itself. But God says, this army, just when they get to the land, as if nothing can stop them, I'm going to make sure that there's a major earthquake at that point. And you know what happens when major earthquakes happen. If you're using the major roads as transportation, you have a problem, because the roads can get just absolutely destroyed. If you're using buildings for whether for supplies, storage, stopping, using for cover, the buildings collapse. And in fact, as God describes this major earthquake, he says, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the birds of the field, every creature that moves on the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, every wall will fall to the ground. God says, I'm going to have this massive earthquake happen, totally disrupt the invasion attempts right as they get to the land of Israel. God says, but I'm not done. He said, let me follow that with friendly fire. Verse 21. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. As the invaders come in, and suddenly their transportation is disrupted, their communication is disrupted. If you're in the middle of an invasion, you're in that threatening environment, and suddenly all hell breaks loose, who are you going to fire at? Well, if I'm speaking Russian, I know who's on my side. But if you're not speaking Russian, I don't know about you. But you got people speaking Russian, you have people speaking Turkish, you have people speaking Arabic, you have people speaking Amharic. You have all these different variations. If I don't hear you speaking my language, I can assume you're a foe, not a friend. And in the confusion, that happens. Well, that even happens today in the war, doesn't it? Friendly fire incident killed 5 American deaths from a missile strike. Even with the best communication, under the best conditions, war brings friendly fire, death from friendly fire. Now imagine a time when you have the Army with all these different trainings and different abilities, and suddenly there's massive disruption. I love this picture. How not to be taking careful aim at your enemy. Imagine in the confusion, you're just, whoever's in my foxhole with me or my trench with me, I know are on my side. Anybody else I'm not sure about. And God says, I'm going to have them dying by the sword of their brother, by their weapons. They're going to be shooting at each other in the confusion. And God says, I'm not done yet. Not only friendly fire, let's have plague and bloodshed. He gets to verse 22, and he says, I will execute judgment upon him with plague and bloodshed. Bloodshed, there are wounds, but now I can't evacuate the wounded. I'm in a fighting situation. They're going to bleed to death. Plague, there's no clean water to drink. There's no way to get the medicines in. The disease is just going to start running rampant among those who've been wounded, who can't be evacuated. And God says, but I'm not done yet. And you can picture here, just in the aftermath of a disaster, all of the wounded, all of the disease that can happen when there's no way to get the people out. He says, I'm going to bring rain and hailstones. He says, get down here on it. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on all his troops and on the many nations with him. Torrents of rain and hailstones. I never thought much about this until I lived in Texas. Well, you have torrents of rain. If you've ever watched a flood, and we're seeing some of it in the Midwest right now, you bring rain on an area that's been devastated by warfare and then by an earthquake, and you've got these mudslides, you've got all the problems, things just get washed away. Hailstorm, and what damage it can do. And if you're in a hailstorm like that, your goal is to get inside, but there's no buildings left because they were destroyed in the earthquake. Your car gets punctuated and you have no place to hide. Hailstones can do a lot of damage. The largest documented hailstone, by the way, was nearly 6 inches in diameter. It reached a speed of 105 miles an hour, twice the size of this one. You have those kind of fastballs being thrown at you from heaven, you're in deep trouble. God says, I'm not done yet. I actually read the next part. He says, I'm going to bring burning sulfur. Not just hailstones, but burning sulfur. I found it fascinating in Israel. In fact, here, a little thing up here. Well, it's not going to cooperate with me there. Now let's go that back. There we go. Try this one. There we go. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee in the middle. Right here, see that black area? That's basalt. That's volcanic rock. When you get to the northern part of Israel, there are actually extinct volcanoes. There's the Rift Valley running right down through the middle of the land. But that area where those volcanoes are, here's what it looks like. You're driving through northern Israel's beautiful country, and you see hills, but they're not the mountains you have like here. That's actually a volcanic peak. And they would say it's extinct, which basically means that it's not exploded any time in recorded history. But it did sometime. And the whole area is dotted with them. Imagine the volcanic activity. Suddenly, those earthquakes come back to life. And the fire and brimstone that gets rained down, God says, I'm going to do that. So if you were going to write something on that, if you were an insurance adjuster and you had to describe what happened to that army, the words you would put down are acts of God. God says, this army is going to get there. They're going to seem unstoppable. And then I'm going to do supernaturally what only I can do. And I'm going to have all of these events, one after another, from floods to earthquakes to hailstones to volcanic eruptions at that very moment, and they're going to destroy the army. And Israel's going to wake up at that point and say, wow, there is a God, and he just saved us. Now, when's it going to take place? Well, where is it going to take place? He says it's going to happen on the mountains of Israel. This event that he's describing happens right in Israel itself. And he says, I'm also going to destroy the lands of the attackers. That is, there's going to be some kind of a response, and after the army is stopped, God is then going to destroy the nations that attacked, which would be Russia and Turkey and Iran. Could that be the U.S. responding back? Could that be Israel, which has, they estimate, 200 nuclear weapons, finally getting a chance to respond? Or could it be God supernaturally? All of those are possible. But God says, when I get done, you're not going to have to worry about Russia or Turkey or Iran or Sudan or Libya anymore. I'm taking care of them. He's going to send fires, what he describes, on the lands of the invaders so that they will no longer be a threat. Now, when does it all take place? Well, he does give us an idea. He says Israel's back in the land, or at least partially back in the land. They're a land of unwalled villages. The people have been brought back from captivity. They're living in safety. Today, that's a good description of Israel. They do seem safe in spite of what you hear on the news. They have they're a very prosperous country and doing quite well. But he says this is going to happen before Israel experiences a national spiritual revival. In fact, at the end of the chapter, one of the results of this battle is that Israel will come to know him. He says, I will no longer hide my face from them. I'll pour my spirit on them, and declares the sovereign Lord, and they will all come to know me. The results of this battle is Israel's going to experience a national revival. Today, most people living in Israel are atheist or agnostic. They don't respond to God. But God says, I'm going to have a battle that's going to force them to acknowledge there is a God, and it's going to bring about that national revival. Now, that leaves me with a key lesson, though. The key lesson is this. While ISIS might have been the most recent crisis, don't take your eyes off of Russia or Iran or Turkey. Because as I look at what's happening in the Middle East, and as you see a scene being set up, God seems to say as the end times get closer, they are going to become the countries that are going to become the dominant threat in the Middle East. Which leads to the final question for this session before we go to lunch. It's this: in light of all we've seen, what should we be doing right now? We know what ISIS has done. We know what's happening in our country. We can see an idea of what might be happening in the Middle East. But what difference should it make in our lives? And that's what we want to explore after lunch. Before I turn it back, though, just a couple things that I mentioned. Somebody said the ISIS Crisis books, I didn't bring enough. They sold out. But if you go on Amazon, you can get it on Amazon.com or CBD. There's a couple places you can find it. So you can get it there. And we do have the devotional, so if you're interested in that, or if you want to hide this from your wife, they say, what are you talking about? Take her a devotional. And say, well, we got that. But otherwise, we'll talk about what we can do, and we also want to talk in the final hour about, somebody asked me, what about the Christianity in the Middle East? What's been happening there? And I want to talk about that as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to these guys for lunch. We're asking, I do a radio program. My goal is moving targets harder to hit. So I'm associate pastor at our church. I do a radio program, and I go to Israel as often as I can. The radio program is the best of all worlds. It's on 450 stations, none of which are in Arizona. My co-host is out of the headquarters of the studio in Chicago. I have an ISDN line in my casita at our house. That's how it's recorded. But if you're ever interested, it's called The Land of the Book. It's online. Go to thelandinthebook.org. You'll see it, and there's a podcast where you can live stream it. It's a weekly program. It's 1 week, or every Saturday we have it online. The goal is to have a mini trip to Israel every week. So it's the first quarter of the program is current events. What's been happening in the world that you need to know about in the Middle East that you might not have heard of. The second quarter is an interview with someone from the Middle East. It's a believer. It's someone who's written a book that's you ought to be familiar with. My co-host does those interviews. They're usually just absolutely fascinating. The third segment is a Bible question and answer. I used to do them all, but when I officially retired from Moody, we got another faculty member to do the question and answer. But people writing questions on the Bible, and they cover the gamut, and he answers them. And I may be taking that back over sometime this summer, but he does a great job right now. Jim Coakley's his name. And then the last section is a devotional. I try and visually talk people into a spot in Israel or somewhere in the Middle East, help you get to the site, explain what you're seeing, and then take that and take it to the Bible so that you have something for the rest of the week from the Bible, from a spot in Israel that can make an impact on your life. I have a lot of fun doing the program, but if you ever want to listen to it, just go to thelandinthebook.org, and you can find it there. You can download them as a podcast, or it has a live streaming of the last week's program. A couple other questions. One of us was asked, what about the Christians in the Middle East, as I've talked about the different groups? Most people, when they think of the Christians in the Middle East, they think of the Crusades, and that's it. In reality, there's been a Christian presence in the Middle East for 2,000 years. Christian Arabs, we were talking with one individual here, we mentioned there's a Chaldean Christian group, there's an Assyrian Christian group, there's a Syriac. Most of them are Eastern Orthodox in orientation, some Roman Catholic. There are some evangelical groups, but there has been a Christian presence, and it continues. The Christians have been under incredible persecution in the Middle East. In fact, in some areas of the Middle East, the Christian population has gone from being 10, 15, 20% of the population down to 1 to 5% of the population, and many of the Christians are leaving as fast as they can. If you hear any of the things going on in Egypt, the Copts make up about 10% of the population of Egypt, and their churches are bombed, the people are killed and slaughtered. It's still going on, and an ISIS group is largely responsible for much of what's happening in Egypt. Now, but there's a good news in all that. When Khomeini came into Iran, they estimated about 400 believers in Iran. His job, he said his goal was to get rid of all the Christians. So how well has he done since 1979? Today they estimate there are 1 million or more believers in Iran. God's church thrives under persecution. And God has not left the Middle East. There are believers there, and that's one of the things I want to talk about a little bit here today. But there are people coming to faith in the Christian in the Middle East. In fact, one of the fastest growing groups of people coming to faith are Muslims. In the last 30 to 40 years, more Muslims have come to faith in Christ than in the previous 1,000 years combined. So God is doing something. We'll talk about it, and if you have any questions, you can ask those at the end as well. So what I want to do is go through this section, but leave enough time to answer questions. So there was one other one that was asked that I'll answer. We just talked about Ezekiel 38, 39, and they said, okay, very briefly, how would you fit all these pieces together? Take this with I told my classes sometimes, take this with a grain of salt. Sometimes you need the whole salt shaker. So take this as my high salt diet. But as I put the Bible together for myself, here's how I see events happening. I don't set dates. I start there. Beware of anybody who says, let me tell you what's going to happen next week, next month, next year. If Jesus didn't know the day or the time, who am I to presume and say I have it better than he does? But as I look at what God has said, it seems to me the next event on God's basic program is he's going to take the church away from the earth. We call it the rapture, but it's 1 Thessalonians 4. God says the believers are going. God was dealing with Israel. He set Israel temporarily aside, has been dealing with the church for 2,000 years. But there's a 7-year period, God says, is for your people, the Jews, your holy city, Jerusalem. That's 7 specific years that's coming up that will culminate in God's return of his Messiah. So I'm looking for God to take his church away and set up that 7-year period. I think I see him setting the stage for that. Israel back in the land after all those years is part of that setting of the stage. The events that are happening in Europe help set the stage for the way God says Europe will look. Events happening in the Middle East and Iraq, Babylon, some others. I see God setting a stage. Once God takes the church away, I think the events are going to roll out rather quickly. We know there's going to be a 7-year agreement made that's going to seem to give Israel peace. It's going to seem to solve the Middle East crisis. The man who does that is someone the Bible later describes as the Antichrist. But he's going to look like this incredible person. He's going to be Donald Trump, Barack Obama, pick anybody that you think of as who's going to win a Nobel Peace Prize rolled into one. He makes this peace. Israel seems like they're safe. But at that point, whatever happens, the U.S. has been weakened because so many Christians were taken out of our country. We don't seem to be a big player in the end times. Russia seizes its chance. Russia, Iran, Turkey launch a surprise invasion in Israel. Israel's taken by surprise, but before they can react, God destroys this invading army. Israel goes, wow, there really is a God. They had put their trust in this person making a peace treaty, but now they realize he didn't help them, nobody else helped them, the U.S. didn't help, but God did. And Israel begins a national revival. The next 3.5 years are relative peace in Israel, but the rest of the world's going to hell in a handbasket. There's troubles going on. You read the book of Revelation, you read about everything from burning mountains falling into the sea, which sounds like an asteroid, to war and rumors of wars. Jesus said, nations will rise against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. There's just going to be a mess in the world that's going to make today look like the good old days. They're going to have troubled times. This fellow who made the peace treaty is going to just seem to be saying to the world, you need to get behind me. We need to get rid of these troubles. For whatever reason, follow me. Israel's been trying to rebuild a temple. They're going to build a temple in Jerusalem. About the middle of the tribulation period, the middle of that 7 years, this guy comes into Jerusalem. He says, by the way, I got a revelation for you. I'm God. You need to worship me. He seems to be killed. He's raised to life. A statue set up in his honor that seems to talk. Miraculous things seem to happen. And most of the world's going to say, okay, we'll follow him. He's going to help it out, by the way, by saying you can't buy or sell without being loyal to me. It is interesting how we're becoming so electronically focused that indeed that's a reality these days. You could get to a system that will encourage you to do what you want. China, if you're following it, just implemented a system that rewards, there's a fancy term for it, but basically social conformity. And it was like 17,000 people weren't allowed to fly on airplanes because their credit was not accepted because they're not conforming socially to where the government wants them. The Antichrist will use something like that to make people conform to him. 2 groups will specifically say, we're not following you. One are going to be the Jews because they just saw what God can do. The other, I believe, are going to be the Muslims. Because for whatever else you think about the Muslims, there's one thing that they say. The reason they're not Christians is Jesus can't be God. A man can't be God. And they're not going to follow a man who claims to be God. And so this leader has some problems. He's now the ruler. He's trying to set his rule over the world, but he's got some problems. So he begins a series of invasions to get rid of the last of the troublemakers. He invades North Africa. And Daniel 11 describes a campaign in North Africa as he gets rid of Egypt and Libya and the areas around there that dared not follow him. And then it says tidings out of the east and north offend him, and he goes forth to destroy and annihilate many. Daniel always speaks from Israel's perspective. So what's east and north of Israel? You got Syria, you've got Iraq, you've got those regions. Iran's gone, remember, Turkey's gone, Russia's gone. He goes into the Arab areas where ISIS has been, and he begins destroying and annihilating men. He's going to get rid of those troublesome Islamic fundamentalists. And then it says the last place he's going to come is pitch his tent between the seas, that's the Mediterranean and the Dead, at the beautiful holy mountain. His final goal is to come back to Israel because he's going to get rid of the pesky Jews. And when he gets there, it says he'll be destroyed without human intervention. That is, when he gets there with victory in sight, Jesus returns. As Jesus comes back, Jesus then sets up his kingdom that he's always promised the Jewish people. And we go into the period the Bible calls the millennium, 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. It's not the end of time yet, because Satan's going to be bound up, let go after that period, and you're going to find out that the real problem in the world has never been oil or economics or society or social problems or poverty. The real problem's always been in the human heart. And when they're given one last chance, people are going to say, follow Jesus in his perfect environment, or tell him no, forget you, Jesus. And in a final rebellion, people say, we're not going to follow you. At that point, God can then justly judge all of the people, the great white throne judgment, and then we get into eternity. Lots to happen before that happens. But the fun part is God's in charge of it. Now, will it happen just like I said? Don't start a new church on it. But I think if we take the Bible at face value, it presents a basic picture, and the picture reminds us, in the world you'll have tribulation. So don't expect things to get any better now. They're going to get a lot worse at some point. But we can just trust God because he's in charge. He's working things out. Now, we've talked about ISIS. We talked about the real problems within the Middle East and how they came about. And it goes back to World War I. It goes back before that. We talked about how ISIS came about and what they've done. We talked about a little just in the future on what God's going to happen. But I want to circle back because I want to end with something more positive. And the positive is this. Can we get it up here? The positive is you should have a slide coming. Oh, here it comes. There it comes. Positive is we're going to go back to the future again. And here's one more little factoid that you didn't know. The Statue of Liberty was originally going to be Islamic. But you didn't realize that. Now, here's the reality of it. The Statue of Liberty was originally designed to look like an Arab peasant woman that was going to stand at the entrance to the Suez Canal in Egypt. The architect who did it, the sculptor, presented a blueprint of the statue, which was to double as a lighthouse, to the Viceroy of Egypt. But when he did, the Egyptians didn't have the money to pay for it. So his work went for naught. However, he did a revised version and titled that one, Liberty Enlightening the World, and that's the Statue of Liberty we know today. So if you can imagine what we have, that's what it was going to originally be. Didn't quite make it, but you do see the similarities. Okay, by way of review though, what have we done? Well, session 1, we had 4 key facts. Islam is at the center of the problem. The current Middle East crisis began during World War I with those 3 agreements, so the West didn't help on this by making an agreement with the Arabs and the Jews that were totally contrary to one another, and then never intending to do either one. By the way, if you want to know, I didn't mention it before, how successful was that, or did they really want to follow through? If you go to the Middle East, Arabic's spoken everywhere, but next to Arabic, if you go to Syria or Lebanon, you know what the second language is next to Arabic? It's French. And if you remember that line that the French drew. But if you went to Egypt or Jordan or Iraq, the language next to Arabic is English, because that was the British sphere. They did carve up the Middle East, and you can see it today even in following the languages that are spoken next to Arabic, where France was influencing and where Britain was influencing. The third fact was water's as precious as oil in the Middle East. And the fourth fact was the Middle East is a complex ethnic and religious tapestry. If you go away saying, man, I am so confused about the Middle East, you are way ahead of where the average journalist is today. It is a mess. I was talking to someone over the break about the Kurds. Most Americans have no clue about the Kurds. and yet it's the largest ethnic group in the world that was never given its own land and its own country. Everybody knows about the Palestinians. They pale in comparison to the Kurds. And they were allies. They helped defeat ISIS, and yet the fear is that the U.S. will abandon them to the Turks. So it's complex. Session 2, we looked at the pedigree of ISIS. We saw those dots. There was the Afghanistan Mujahideen that we helped to raise up support to defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. But once Russia left, we kind of abandoned them. We left Afghanistan as a basket case. And the Taliban, the students, those who had come up during that war, were led by Muhammad Omar, and they ended up taking over Afghanistan and turned it into an Islamic Shiite Sharia law-dominated country. Al-Qaeda came up next, and Al-Qaeda means the base. Osama bin Laden had actually fought against the Russians in Afghanistan, had studied under the Taliban. When the U.S. came in and from his perspective, invaded Saudi Arabia and other countries there to stop Saddam Hussein, he saw that as the round two. He'll help stop the Russians. He's going to help stop the Americans. And Al-Qaeda began in '91. He kept trying to get America. It wasn't until 2001 that he was wildly successful with the World Trade Center bombing. Al-Qaeda franchised as we began driving the leadership underground. The most successful franchise was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In 2004, that's when they developed their incredibly brutal tactics, and they morphed eventually into ISIS or ISIL or Daesh with al-Baghdadi when he came along and just basically tried to subsume subsume Al-Qaeda in Syria. When he was rebuffed, he said, well, we're a new organization. We are the caliphate, and I'm the first caliph. And we said in the third session, there's a threat worse than ISIS. It's 3 countries that today are trying to form a unity, are trying to get together, and they match exactly with the countries that were described in the book of Ezekiel that are going to unify and attack Israel. But that leads to where we are now, and you say, okay, here, my Lord, but what can I do? You know, it's not like I'm a government, not like I have incredible power. If all of that's true, what can I do to make a difference? Well, we need to distinguish something. We need to distinguish between what God expects of governments and what he expects of individuals. And I really do see a distinction in the Bible between the two. God ordained government to hold evil in check and to hold evildoers to account. That is one of the key functions of government. In fact, I'll give you an example of that. In Proverbs 20, when a king sits on his throne to judge, he winnows out all evil with his eyes. A wise king winnows out the wicked. He drives the threshing wheel over them. What Proverbs is saying is you want to have a good government, a good land, have a king who's promoting righteousness and who is out to quash evil. That's what a ruler ought to be doing. God specifically gives government responsibility for waging war and for implementing capital punishment. I may step on some toes with this one, but follow along with me. One of those verses that gives people a lot of problems, Samuel says to Saul in 1 Samuel 15, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. God put you in charge of Israel. So, listen now to the message from the Lord. Here's God's message to you as the leader. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Israel was to destroy the Amalekites. Saul didn't do it. He left the king of the Amalekites alive. He kept all the best sheep and goats and all the property alive and brought them back. But he was told to wipe it all out. In fact, as a result, God says, I'm rejecting you as king. You're not going to be there anymore because you didn't do what I wanted. It's interesting. God had an assignment. God sets up nations and takes them down. God can use other nations to accomplish that. But God held Israel to a task, and that is, I'm judging the Amalekites. I'm going to use you. You better do exactly what I say. And when Israel failed to follow God's command, Israel suffered the consequences. Later in history, a descendant of the Amalekites was a guy named Haman, and he nearly wiped out all of the Israelites. It was Mordecai and Esther that saved him. But all that happened because Saul failed to do what he was supposed to do. The leaders, governments, are responsible for promoting peace, for putting down evil, but they're acting as instruments of God when they do it. Rulers hold no terror. This is New. You say, well, that's Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, they do. But do what is right, and he will commend you, for he's God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he doesn't bear the sword for nothing. He's God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. That's what God holds leadership and countries accountable to. By the way, when Paul wrote this, Nero was the head of Rome. And yet Paul is saying he was put there by God. He's established as an agent. Now, an agent can go wrong, and God holds them accountable. But God holds nations accountable for putting down evil, and that includes capital punishment. In fact, bearing the sword, in this case, is actually capital punishment, is what Paul's talking about. Leaders have that ability to hold those accountable, even to the point of putting those who cause tremendous evil to death. God-ordained government, God specifically gives government responsibility for waging war and implementing capital punishment. But here's the balance to it. God does not give individuals the right to take his law into their own hands. What God allows for nations, what God gives as an assignment to nations, doesn't mean that God gives individuals a chance to do their own vigilante justice. One of the things about our country that is so good historically is that when it came down to issues like crime and punishment and capital punishment, we had laws, they're very set laws with juries. We follow a very set pattern so that no one individual can exercise vengeance on someone else. We have a system in place to assign that responsibility to agents that are put in place by the government. Now, we need to distinguish what God expects of governments, what he expects of individuals. How do I know that about individuals? Well, God says, you shall not murder. He could call Israel to judge the Amalekites, but he gives a command to Israel, you shall not murder. As an individual, you have no right to take someone else's life. Do not take revenge, my friends. Leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. And what God chooses to do as God, we can't take into our hands as individuals. Why is that so crucial? Christ Church, just last week. God never approved of murder. This guy decides Islam is bad, therefore I'm going to take a gun, go into a mosque, and shoot Muslims. What he did was wrong. He took vengeance into his own hands, and God said, vengeance is mine, I'll repay. That individual chose to take the place of God, and in doing so he was wrong. And that's, by the way, the real problem. The first part of what I've shared, when people hear it, they go, okay, I hear what you're saying, but it makes me feel uneasy because look what this guy did. He would have agreed with the first part of what I talked about today. He saw the problems with Islam. He saw that he'd gone over to Turkey and studied. He'd gone through the Middle East and studied and came to a conclusion. And the conclusion is, I need to start a religious war as a Christian against Muslims, and I need to get people to start killing Muslims. He went beyond what God allowed him to do as an individual. And that's why I started. There's a problem, but what God gives government and what God gives individuals is different. So how should we as individuals respond to ISIS, or respond to Muslim fundamentalists, or respond to Muslims in general? That's where I want to focus. There's a place for government. I want to focus on individuals because that's who we are. And here's where I'd say. They did a Monmouth University poll, and they said 61% of those surveyed are personally concerned about ISIS. Now, ISIS is gone, so that result will go down. Whoever replaces ISIS, it'll come back up. The reality is it's whack-a-mole. ISIS is defeated. We just know that within weeks, months, a short period of years at the latest, something will take its place, and our concern will be back up. We suffer from ADHD when it comes to news. We are just all over the place, and something else will capture our attention, and then when we hear Islam again, it'll take us by surprise because we forgot to pay attention to it. But there was a tremendous concern. In the face of ISIS, Christians shared conflicting emotions. Were these your emotions as you read through what ISIS was doing a year or so ago? Well, there's outrage when you saw some of the beheadings, saw the cruelty. There's frustration. Why can't we do something about them? Why can't something happen? There's confusion. Are they around us? Why are we letting people in? How are we vetting individuals to know that they're not creating a problem for us? Frankly, there's fear. Is this something I should be worried about for my family in the coming days, weeks, months, years? And that leads to anxiety. And these are the emotions that, as the news focused on what was happening, what was going through every American's mind. But God hasn't given us a spirit of fear. And that's where you have to go back to the scripture. But of power and love and a sound mind. That's 2 Timothy 1:7. Which is interesting because when you think about it, God's given us the power. Well, he's given us supernatural enablement. We have the Holy Spirit as believers. We have an enablement from God that allows us to understand, to recognize he's in charge. He's given us love, which is compassion even for your enemies. I mean, when Jesus said, love your enemies, to do good to them that persecute you or despitefully use you, that's what God has put in us. Love is what distinguishes Christians from others in a rightful way. And he's given us a sound mind, which really is the idea of self-control. We don't need to run off like chickens with our heads cut off. We can stop and think through and put in perspective what's happening around us, understanding God's bigger picture for the world and understanding what God has written to us as believers. So we don't have to have that spirit of fear. We really should be responding counter to what our society around us does. Some other examples. Galatians 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Christians are supernaturally equipped to respond in life-changing ways. As individuals, we are salt and light. We're designed to respond in ways that will impact people around us and move them toward God. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. That's what Jesus said. And he said the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And when the religious leaders questioned, well, who's my neighbor? Isn't it interesting that Jesus actually used the most despised of the groups in their area, the groups that they were having problems with, the Samaritans, who had persecuted Jews, who had killed Jews. The Jews had gone and wiped out their temple. There was a religious conflict going on, and Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan to explain what a neighbor is. It's the people around us. Okay, so let's go to the worst. So how can my response to ISIS help my neighbors? Or whoever that next Islamic fundamentalist group is. How can I respond in a way that's going to make an impact around me? Well, I say it this way. Your neighbors were watching the same news broadcast. They're dealing with the same conflicting emotions as you. You realize the people who live around you aren't immune. They had the same concerns. They have questions. It's an excellent occasion to discuss the emotions you share in common. Hey, how do you feel about that? I understand. And it's also an open opportunity to share God's perspective. 1 Peter 3:5, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Hopefully you have a response to say, well, yeah, it really is bad. However, I really think God has the situation in control. Why do you think that? I now have an opening to share what God has done in my life that gives me that hope. But what if my neighbors are Muslims? What about the gas station where I get my gas in the convenience store there? The guy could be a Muslim. Well, my neighbors are Muslim. You need to understand, they're also searching for understanding. They value authentic relationships. They often struggle to acclimate to new culture, especially if they're students, and you have, I'm sure, at AU, some students who are from Muslim countries, and they're often willing to discuss spiritual issues. Christians, like politics and religion, we don't want to talk about. In Muslim cultures, they're willing to talk about both. And they'll respond to genuine love and concern. In the book, a friend of mine, Mark Tobey, who's a co-writer, was living in a college town and had talked to some individuals, and the Muslims said, when they're asked about their opinion of Americans, it basically was they're friendly, but they make lousy friends. That is, Americans are open. Hey, how you doing? That's great. But Americans tend to be very shallow in those friendships. Muslims value deeply friendships. Americans who reach out. I had a friend who would go to a gas station and say, made friends with the Muslim who was there. I said, how are things going? Oh, well, he said enough. Finally, the guy said, well, my daughter's really she's sick. He said, I'll pray for her. The next time he came back to get gas, he said, oh, well, I'm praying for your daughter. How's she doing? And it immediately built a level of friendship that he wouldn't have had before. They're looking for just people who genuinely love and have shown concern for them. Ask the Lord to open the hearts of your neighbors to the gospel. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. This is Paul in the city of Philippi. He first gets there and he goes out where there should be a Jewish, there's no synagogue in the town, so he goes out where the group of Jewish men should be holding their service. There weren't even enough Jewish men. There were a group of women, probably some Jewish women, and then this Gentile woman who was searching for God there. Her name was Lydia. By the way, she was a dyer. You got to think about that. So she dealt in purple cloth. She was a dyer of purple. So I claim her as my first relative. She was a worshiper of God. And it's interesting, the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. It wasn't like Paul had some special thing. In fact, I suspect he would have preferred to have a group of Jewish men to share with. But the one God had prepared happened to be this woman. And she heard, responded, and the gospel actually came to the Gentiles, moved into Europe. And most of us with a European background, we have a woman who was a dyer of purple, a seller of purple, to thank for that because God opened her heart to listen to the message and to respond. If you become friends, just become friendly to individuals, God will open up opportunities for Muslims to hear and share the gospel. I got to stop here for a second. I mentioned briefly about Muslims coming to faith. You may have heard or read about the dreams and visions. When I first heard about this, I was very skeptical. It's not what we're taught in Dallas Seminary. Here's what's been happening. Islam began with Muhammad having dreams, visions, where an angel appeared to him. I think it was demonic, and I think that's how he got the Quran. But Islam itself is based on the understanding that dreams are real, visions are real. It's the way God communicates. Within Islam itself, it is so patriarchal, so family-oriented that if you leave Islam, you're shaming the family. And shame and honor are two things that drive Islam. And if you shame the family, the only way they can regain honor is by killing you, which is a big demotivator for someone leaving the faith. Which is why for so many years it was so hard for anybody to ever leave Islam. And yet, about 30, 40 years ago, something began happening in a rather dramatic fashion. Muslims began having dreams and visions. They didn't always stay the same, but they would be something similar. Someone in white would appear and call them by name and say, you need to find them. They would get the impression this person was someone who genuinely loved them, cared for them. They wanted to know more about them, and they would be told to search for them. Sometimes the dreams would direct them to the Bible, and they would go try and find a Bible and begin reading it, hear about Jesus, and come to faith. Sometimes it would direct them to an individual. Sometimes it would tell them, even show them the person, but it would direct them to a person that happened to be a believer. And when they revealed themselves, that person would share their faith. One particular person is a Dallas grad and a friend of mine has a ministry to Muslims, and first-hand account of this, their leader in Egypt was walking through the souk, the marketplace, and a woman dressed in her full veil started shouting, "You're the man! You're the man!" Which you don't want to have a Muslim woman pointing at you and shouting out, "You're the man!" And so he tried to cross the way, but she followed him, saying, "You're the man." And so finally, when he got a little bit further away, he stopped and said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You were in my dreams last night. You had that shirt on, you had that hat on. Why were you in my dream?" He said, "Well, okay, let's go over here." So he took her out to a more quiet spot and said, "Well, let me share what that probably was." And he shared the gospel, that God put me in your dreams so that you could hear this message about Jesus, because he's the Son of God and he's your Savior. And Muslims are responding to that to the extent where I said before, there were 400 believers in Iran when Khomeini came to power, and now the estimate is 1 million or more, some go up to 2 million, who have come to faith. They're giving their lives. When they're caught, family disown them. If family don't kill them, the government will kill them. But part of the reason for the dreams and visions is it took something that dramatic to break through to that culture. I was concerned about it because I know the gospel is supposed to, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. But in these dreams, the ones I've heard about that seem to have the same pattern, it's not that the dream leads the person to faith. The dream leads the person to a believer or to the Bible. And it's the testimony of the believer, they're sharing their faith, or the Bible that leads the person to faith. I thought of Acts chapter 10 and Cornelius. Cornelius had a vision. And when the angel appeared to him, he says, summon Peter, he'll tell you what you need to hear. The vision didn't tell Cornelius how to come to faith. It sent Cornelius to Peter. Peter shared how to come to faith. And that's what's been happening in the Middle East. Individuals are coming to faith. That's also happening here in the States. In fact, if you're ever with a Muslim individual and you want to test them, just say something like, I've heard of there's been people having dreams in the Muslim world of someone in white or someone amazing. Have you ever experienced something like that? And if they say no, you just go on. But if they say yes, say, well, what did the person say and what did they have you do? And if they open up to you, you could say, they may have been telling you to come to me. And use that as the opening to share your faith. But God is using it, the estimates are somewhere between 25 and 50% of the Muslims who've come to faith have done so as a direct result of having had a dream or vision that led them to a believer. That has to be God at work, and only God doing that. Okay, so much for the commercial. Back to the message. So you need to pray. And the question you want to ask is, so how do I pray for Muslims? And what do I need to pray for the world? And I'll start with this. First, pray for Christians in danger around the world. We need to, if you don't follow Voice of the Martyrs, some of these other groups that talk about the Christians who are in danger, be praying for Christians around the world. But what should you be praying for them? Well, first, pray for boldness to share for these Christians and ministers of the gospel. You don't need to, the first prayer we tend to think is, God, keep them away, deliver them. But maybe the first thing we ought to be praying for is, Lord, in the midst of those dangerous situations, give them wisdom and boldness. That's what Paul said in Ephesians 6. He's in prison. Pray also for me that whenever I speak, words may be given me so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly as I should. Paul didn't say, pray that the chains will drop off. Pray that the people won't come. Pray that the government will find me innocent. They'd like to have all of that. But his prayer, he says, what you really been praying for is pray to give me the wisdom and the fearlessness to share the gospel. And we ought to be praying that for the martyrs out there, for the Christians who are being persecuted. Lord, continue to keep them faithful to you, even in the difficult times. I think we can also pray that the gospel would flourish in those difficult places. Frankly, not just in Muslim places, North Korea. The only hope for North Korea is the gospel. And that's probably the most dangerous place in the world today for believers. But we need to pray that the gospel would flourish in those places. Give the Christians the opportunity and the freedom to share your word, and then have the hearts be prepared of those that they're sharing with, so that they can hear the word. It's love that will ultimately conquer, and the message of the gospel shared in a loving heart that can change lives. There it is. Paul said, I want you to know what has happened has really served to advance the gospel. Because of my change, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It's interesting, Paul's in prison. He says, hey, the gospel's going out. And by the way, if you read on, he says, now some of these people are just jealous of me. They're doing this hoping that they'll give me a greater punishment. He says, but others are doing it because they're encouraged by me, and now they're sharing. He says, I don't care. The gospel's getting out. That's all that matters to me. Paul was wanting the gospel to be shared because that would make the difference. This comes again from my friend who's a Dallas grad, their ministry in Egypt. When someone comes and says, I had a dream, they share the gospel, they come to faith, they say, but before you make that decision, there's two questions we need to ask you. And if you want to be a follower of Jesus, one, are you willing to be persecuted for Jesus? Are you willing to have persecution? Because that's what will happen if you come to faith. And if the person says, I'm willing, they say, okay, well then, are you willing to die if you come to Jesus? Because that's very likely what could happen to you. Now, as he said, can you imagine the new members classes in most churches? Before you become a member, here's the two questions we need to have you ask. And yet, these people they've been so motivated because of the dream, hearing the gospel, that they say, I'm willing to suffer persecution, I'm willing to die And a person like that, who's motivated to share the gospel in love, is what makes an impact. And we need to be praying for those believers. Revelation 12 has one of these interesting verses. The believers, the martyrs, they overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. If you want to know how to overcome Satan, 3 things. The first one is it says the blood of the Lamb. What is it that overcomes Satan? It's Jesus, his death on the cross. He paid the penalty that will break Satan. But second, the word of their testimony, God's word shared, is powerful enough to break people away from the chains of Satan. And the third part was they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. What Satan tries to do is bring fear in people. If you share the gospel, you can get killed. And if someone says, and the problem with that is, I go to heaven, I get to be with Jesus, I have an eternal reward, and I realize there is no downside to dying if I'm a believer, Satan at that point loses any control over you through fear. And you overcome Satan by what Jesus has done, by the word of God he's given you, and by a willingness to share, understanding that this life isn't all there is to life. That's why Paul said in Philippians, and this is what kept him motivated. For me, to live is Christ, and dying, that's just a plus. I gain from that one. And if I recognize that death isn't something that I dread, at that point, Satan has no power. Now, all of that was saying, pray for believers. Pray for their boldness. Pray for them to continue sharing Christ. But also pray for the Lord's personal protection for believers. You do need to pray for them, that God would watch over them. Paul said, and this is his last letter, he was about ready to die, he was going to be executed. He said, my first defense, when he appeared before Nero this time, no one came to my support, everyone deserted me. When it became obvious that Nero was going to persecute believers, when the going got tough, most people got going. And they left Paul in the lurch. Luke was still there were a few others, but most people left him. But I like what Paul says then, but the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength. Though anybody else leave, he said there's one person who's always going to be there, and it's Jesus. And we need to pray that these who are under persecution recognize that Jesus is there with them, that they have a unique sense of his presence and care and love, and will sustain them. In fact, Paul went on and said, I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. Paul expected to die. He knew he was going to die, and he did die. But he knew even as that was happening, God was still with him, Jesus was with him, and he was going to close his eyes here on earth and awaken in heaven. And he said, then to him be glory forever and ever, amen. If we keep the right perspective, it is amazing how God will take away the fear and allow us to be bold in our witness for him. So what else can I do? Anything else that I can do to make a difference in my life right now? Well, I think you focus on your relationship with Jesus is the bottom line for us. You need to make sure I know Jesus and I put my trust in Jesus, and whatever's going to happen in my life, I can trust Jesus to take me through it, whatever that is. Whether it's in prison like Paul was, whether it's under Islamic control as many believers are in the Middle East, or whether it's just living here in the U.S. and I'm kind of upset with some of the things happening around me in our government. Whatever it is, if I'm with Jesus and I know he's in charge, he'll give me the calmness and the peace and the wisdom to go through it. And I want to end with an illustration and then open it up for questions. The illustration is two people. Some of you know who this is. Most of you don't. They're Horatio and Anna Spafford. They took pictures back then. It was a serious thing, so he looks rather stern. But the impression I read of him, he's a pretty fun-loving guy. He was a lawyer in Chicago in the 1800s. He was a friend of D.L. Moody's. In fact, in the Chicago campaigns of D.L. Moody, Spafford was there helping out. In the Chicago fire, here's an example. Here's Spafford, McDade, and Wilson was the attorneys at law. And they were in the Republic Life building in LaSalle Street, just down the street from where Moody Bible Institute ended up being. They had a beautiful house just in this, actually being near North Side now, but in the suburbs of Chicago. But when the Chicago fire hit in 1871, his law offices burned to the ground. And he lost everything that was in that building. He had done well, and he had invested in property in Chicago. And most of his investments went south. So he went from being pretty well off and secure to having a little shakier financial posture after the Chicago fire. And in fact, there was a panic in Chicago. And so the fire created other problems that caused financial difficulties. Well, Spafford felt like he promised his family to go to Europe, and so he sent his wife and 4 daughters on ahead to Europe on the Ville de Havre, which, as this gives you an impression, the Ville de Havre happens to be that ship right there. It's not doing so well. It was struck on the North Atlantic by this other ship. It sank in 12 minutes. It's pre-Titanic. There weren't enough lifeboats. There weren't enough of anything. The mother, Anna, managed to get her 4 children up on deck. But when the ship went under, all 4 of her kids were sucked out of her arms. She was knocked unconscious. The ship that hit them sent out a rescue vessel. They actually found her floating, and they rescued her before she drowned herself. But all the kids were drowned. She got, in fact, here's pictures of the 4 children, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta were the 4 kids. She got, that ship limped itself to Europe, and she sent a telegram home to her husband. Here's the telegram that she actually sent. They wrote it out and gave it to Spafford. And it's to Spafford on LaSalle Street, Chicago, and it starts in the economy of it. Saved alone, what shall I do? She named afterward the kids who were in a family traveling party who'd been killed, and then she told where she was. Now imagine if you got a note like that. In fact, hold on here as I hit the one button just for a second. Oh, I want to go back to it there. Saved alone, what should I do? She names all these people. Willie Culver lost. Go with Loriot until they answer reply. You can get a telegram like that. You've lost your business. You've lost most of your financial well-being, and now you've lost your kids, and your spouse is on another continent. This is pre-CNN, Fox News. It's before Spafford. This is his first hailstone, if you will, that hits him, saying, "Your family's gone." He drops everything, goes, books passage on another ship, and tries to go over to be with his wife. He takes a piece of paper from a hotel in Chicago, the Brevard House Hotel, and tries to record his thoughts on it. But we know how he was responding, how he felt, for 2 reasons. One, he wrote a letter while he was on ship to his sister, Rachel. And he said, on Thursday last, we passed over the spot where the ship went down in mid-ocean, the water 3 miles deep. But I do not think of our dear ones there. They're safe, folded. That is, they're in God's sheepfold in heaven, the dear lambs. And there before very long shall we be too. In the meantime, thanks to God, we have an opportunity to serve and praise Him for His love and mercy to us and ours. Then he quotes Psalm 104. I will praise Him while I have my being. May we each one arise, leave all, and follow Him. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I could write a letter like that as I'm alone by myself in my cabin going across the Atlantic, thinking that I'm right at the spot where my kids went down and drowned. But you think, what an amazing guy to see the mercy of God and His love and understand that we're not here that long and I'm going to follow God. We also know how he felt, not only because of this letter, but because of that piece of paper he brought from the hotel, the Brevard House Hotel in Chicago. He took it, you can actually see on the original here, it's folded in 3 parts. You can see this guy folding this paper in thirds, putting it in his jacket pocket, pulling it out, and he started trying to sketch out a poem on that piece of paper. Here's what he wrote. The first line says, when peace like a river attendeth my way, or when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. His second line, though Satan should buffet, though trial should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, has shed His own blood for my soul. My sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part but the whole, is nailed to the cross and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. But I read that poem and it's a lot like that letter. I think, man, could I have written those words? How could he have such a faith in Jesus, such an understanding to know that even in those difficult times, God was there, cared for him? Well, he did it in part by remembering what Jesus had done for him. He shed His own blood for my soul. He understands how I fail because he went through similar dark days and gave his life to provide life for me. But we also know how he felt because of the last verse. And if you could all stand up here and look at this closely, the last verse has all sorts of corrections on it. First 3 lines, first 3 stanzas, the way he sketched it out are basically the way it came out in the hymn books. But the last one he couldn't get right. He has, O Lord, dost Lord, thou Lord, and then he has 3 different endings on it. He just can't get it to work right. And in fact, he never got it right until it finally showed up in the hymn books when he finally had it the way he wanted to say it. His last verse, here you can see, by the way, some of it, it said, our God, and Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, he had one word off, and then trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend, a song in the night, O my soul. No, that's not it. Underneath it, dost thou watch it the way, my Lord. No, that's not it. He couldn't get it right until he finally got the last words. And by the way, the last words came from the last part of the book of Revelation. Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, the Lord shall descend, even so it is well with my soul. That's how it finally came out. That's what he wanted. He's thinking about Jesus coming back. How can he make sense in life when your kids are gone, when your finances are wiped out? He says, what I can remember is this. God has a day. I'm walking by faith. I don't understand everything. I freely admit it. But someday I'm going to see it. Someday the other side will be revealed. And Lord, I can't wait for you to bring that day. The clouds are going to be rolled back as a scroll. The trump's going to resound. Jesus is coming back. And I'll see my kids again. I'll understand why it's going, why what has happened. Lord, I sure hope you bring that day in a hurry. That's what kept him going. And then he gets to the last line. He says, even so, it's well with my soul. He goes, Jesus is coming. Even so, it's okay. Well, he must have meant something else. You notice it's in quotation marks and it has a dash following. He's still quoting Scripture, but he expects you to know the verse and finish it. He's quoting the next to the last verse in the book of Revelation, the next to the last verse in the Bible. Jesus said, he which testifies to these things, the old King James Version was what he had, says, surely I come quickly, I'm coming soon. And John responded, amen, even so, come Lord Jesus. That's what Horatio Spafford had in mind. Lord, haste the day when the faith will be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, the Lord shall descend. And then Spafford breathed back, oh, amen, even so, come Lord Jesus. That's what you're supposed to fill in when you sing it. Because then you can say, now that I remember that, it's well with my soul. I don't have all the answers for this life, but Jesus does. I don't understand why the pain and suffering and the troubles happen, but he does. And someday he's going to make it right, and I'll just wait on him. I love it. The Revelation, as it gets to the end, says one other thing. The Spirit and the bride say, come. Let him who hears say, come. Whoever's thirsty, let him come. Whoever wishes, let him take the free gift of the water of life. The hope for Islam is the same hope for us. And that is that Jesus loved everybody so much he died for us. And we all have to make a choice. And I trust all of you have, but I don't know you, so I don't know that for sure. But I do know that Jesus purchased eternal life and said it's a gift. And I give it to you, and all you need to do is take it. It's a free gift of the water of life. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to work for it. You just say, Lord, I know I'm a sinner. I know you died for me. And Lord, I want to put my trust in you. Thank you for what you've done for me. And when you do that, you pass from death to life. When you share that with a Muslim, and they finally build that friendship, and it finally comes true in their mind, they pass from death to life. And the best way to stop ISIS or Islamic fundamentalism or any other problem is the truth that God had, that God loves us so much, he sent his son to die for us. And only Jesus will ultimately provide the solution for the ISIS crisis or for any other crisis in this world. Now, I've got a grand total of 5 minutes left till we're done. And so for 5 minutes, what questions, what did I not cover that would be important to cover? The only stupid question is the one you don't ask, but you knew you should have. Yes?
European Union is still courting relationships with the Middle East. Do they play a role in all that?
Yeah, do they play a role today or in the final days? Yeah. Europe is courting relationships with the Middle East. In Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, God gave Daniel a list of 4 empires that were going to be around that will lead up to God's kingdom coming. Babylon was the first, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. When Jesus came the first time, who was in charge of the area? It was the Roman Empire. When Jesus comes the second time, there's going to be a revived form of that Roman Empire, a European confederacy, or whatever you want to call it, that will somehow be impacting the Middle East and opposing Jesus. I do find it interesting that Daniel, as he describes it, says that fourth empire will be like iron mixed with clay. It won't mix together. They'll be divided people. They'll have the strength of iron and yet not be united. There's no better way to describe Europe today. They are a mess. You see them in terms of practical. They're courting the Middle East. Germany and Turkey have a relationship that goes back to World War I. France with the Algerians, the Moroccans, the North Africans have an open relationship with the Islamic countries there that goes back a long way, and in Lebanon and Syria because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So you're watching this emigration into France and into all of the European countries. We think we have a lot of Muslims in our country. We pale in comparison to the percentage of Islam-related people in Europe. So I think that we're seeing that relationship, and I think that's going to continue into that final tribulation, because that final empire will be centered in Europe somewhere. Don't know who's going to be leading it, but it's somewhere there, and it has that connection with Islam in some way. Any other questions? Yes?
What part do you see China playing in all this?
You know, it's interesting. There's what part do I see China playing? And not a large role, if there is one. There's one verse in Revelation that talks about the Euphrates drying up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And people have driven lots of trucks through that. Could that refer to China or the east? It could. It could refer to India. It could refer to anything that's east of the Euphrates River. But apart from that one verse, we don't have anything. Oh, there's one that talks about 200 million man army, or 100 million man army. The problem is it's a demonic army, a demonic host, not human people. So I would end up saying that there's such a small amount in the Bible that we don't know. And the follow-up question, where's the U.S. in Bible prophecy? And the answer is we're not there. Except when it says all the cities of the nations fall, or it mentions all the nations following. If we're there at all, we're a follower country. But we do know that in the book of Revelation, it's one of the saddest parts, that at one point, 1/3 of the, 1/4 of the world's population is going to be wiped out. Another point, it says 1/3 is going to be wiped out. If you do the math on that, that means half the world's population will be destroyed in that period. That could also be where China and the U.S. end up. So we're not told, and so I've got to be very careful at that point. But they don't seem to play the major outsized role that the nations around the Middle East do. Yes?
I'm originally from the Netherlands. I lived there for 16 years. And at that time, most of the people went to church. Nowadays, it seems like nobody goes to church anymore. Is that something that was...
I think you're right. He lived in the Netherlands for 16 years. Most people went to church. Now it seems like almost none go to church. And you're right, Europe is post-Christian. Our country is rapidly trying to catch up, it seems. In fact, in Europe, probably the more faithful, there are more people in the mosque on Friday than there are in church on Sunday. That's it. Now, on the positive side, does that mean that God's given up or God can't do anything? No. But what it does mean is we need to be praying for God to continue a witness in Europe. They desperately need to hear the good news of Christ, because it's not being preached in most churches. People aren't there, and Islam continues to grow, so they need to hear the good news as well. Now, I'm always a teacher. I always knew when the bell would ring, no matter where I was, the class was going to get up and walk out. By my watch, I have 30 seconds, so that's a good place for me to turn it over to Ron and to say thank you for the opportunity to be with you.